My name is Quinn, and I am 27 years old. At my grandmother Beatrice's will reading, my relatives popped champagne over their new millions in cash and real estate. I, the only granddaughter who held her hand when she died, received a single, yellowed envelope containing a phone number. My older sister Brittany laughed, calling it a homeless shelter address. But when I dialed that number later, a deep voice answered that he had been waiting for my call for a very long time. Before I reveal what that phone call unlocked, let me know where you are watching from in the comments and hit subscribe. The attorney's office smelled of expensive cologne and greed. My father Richard and mother Patricia admired documents transferring $2 million into their joint account. Brittany shopped for designer bags online. Her husband Jamal, a sharp-dressed African-American real estate fund manager who loved to show off, leaned back with a satisfied smirk. I sat quietly holding my yellowed envelope. Before I could stand, my mother slid a stack of legal papers toward me, tossing a silver pen on top. "Sign this right now, Quinn," my mother commanded. "We need this resolved today." It was a lease transfer agreement. I lived in a small, rent-controlled apartment downtown, a property technically belonging to my parents. I paid my rent on time every month from my salary as an urban planner. "What is this?" I asked. Jamal leaned forward. "It is a surrender of tenancy," he said smoothly. "I am breaking ground on my billion-dollar commercial mega-complex next month. Your apartment building is in the middle of Phase 1. We are bulldozing it. Your parents sold the lot to my fund." "You are kicking me out?" I asked. "I have a legal lease. I pay rent. You cannot just throw me on the street." "Do not use that ungrateful tone," my father snapped. "You are 27, single, and dig in city sewers for a living. You have no future. Jamal is building a legacy for this family. That mega complex will put our name on the map." "It is an urban planning job, Dad," I corrected calmly. "I analyze zoning laws. I do not dig in sewers, and my lease is valid for another 2 years. Brittany scoffed. "Oh, please, Quinn, stop pretending you have a real career. Jamal is bringing wealth into this family. Sign the paper and get out of his way. You are so selfish." I looked at my sister, the golden child whose extravagant lifestyle was entirely funded by our parents and whatever money Jamal managed to pull from his investors. "If Jamal has a billion-dollar fund," I said carefully, "he can afford to buy out my lease properly through the housing authority." Jamal's smirk vanished. "Listen to me carefully, Quinn. I do not have time to play bureaucratic games with a low-level city employee. I need those demolition permits filed by Monday. Sign the paper." "I am not signing anything," I replied. I tossed the silver pen back across the table. "If you want my apartment, you can serve me with a formal eviction notice. Until then, stay away from my home." The silence was absolute. My parents stared at me in shock. I had spent my entire life swallowing their insults and accepting my role as the family disappointment. They expected me to fold immediately. "You miserable little failure," my father hissed, his face turning a dark red. "You will sign those papers right now, or I will personally throw your belongings onto the sidewalk tonight. We own you." I stood up, grabbing my purse. "You do not own me. I pay my bills. I built my own life. I am done being treated like garbage so you can worship Jamal." Before I could take a step, Brittany sprang from her chair. She grabbed her glass of ice water and hurled the contents directly into my face. The freezing water hit my eyes and soaked the front of my blouse. "You are a pathetic loser, Quinn," Brittany screamed. "Jamal is a genius and you are just jealous. Get out of our sight. If you do not sign those papers by tomorrow, we will destroy you." My mother and father did not reprimand her. They just watched me with expressions of pure disgust. I wiped ice water from my eyes. I did not yell back. I did not cry. I just looked at them, memorizing the contempt on their faces. I turned around and walked out of the office without a word. I stepped onto the busy city sidewalk. A heavy afternoon rain had just begun to fall. The cold wind cut through my thin blouse, but I hardly felt it. My mind was racing. I had no idea where I was going to live. I knew my parents would make good on their threat to illegally lock me out of my apartment. I had a modest savings account, but nowhere near enough to fight a high-powered real estate fund manager like Jamal in court. I sought shelter under the awning of a closed cafe, Shivering, I reached into my purse and pulled out the yellowed envelope. I tore it open. There was no letter, no explanation, just a crisp white card with a local phone number printed in elegant black ink. With nothing left to lose, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a man answered. Winston Wealth Management, a voice said. Hello, I said, my teeth chattering slightly from the cold. My name is Quinn. My grandmother Beatrice left me this number. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The tone immediately shifted to one of profound respect. We have been waiting for your call for a very long time, heir. Please come to our offices immediately. We have an empire to discuss. The address the voice provided led me to a sleek glass high-rise in the financial district. I stood in the lobby, dripping rainwater onto the polished marble floor. A security guard discreetly guided me to a private elevator, which whisked me up to the top floor. The doors opened directly into a reception area that looked more like a museum than an office. Deep mahogany paneling lined the walls, and a silver plaque read, Winston Wealth Management. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a meticulously tailored suit stood waiting for me. He bypassed the receptionist entirely and extended his hand. I am Arthur Winston, he said, his tone carrying a profound respect I had never experienced from my own family. Your grandmother Beatrice spoke of you often, Quinn. Please come into my office. I followed him into a massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I sat in a leather guest chair, clutching the yellowed envelope in my damp hands. I do not understand, I admitted. My parents just signed for millions downstairs. They said my grandmother left me nothing but this phone number. Brittany said it was a joke. Arthur poured me a glass of warm tea and slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the massive oak desk. It was no joke, Quinn. Your grandmother was a brilliant woman. She knew exactly who her son was. She knew Richard was driven by greed and that Patricia cared only for status and public image. She knew they would squander liquid cash on vanity projects and spoil Brittany while entirely neglecting you. So she left them the distraction money. She left them the cash accounts and the suburban properties to keep them busy and feeling superior. I stared at the heavy portfolio, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. What did she leave me? Arthur unlocked the portfolio with a soft click. She left you the empire. Your grandmother was not a poor pensioner surviving on Social Security checks and baking cookies in a modest duplex. That was a carefully constructed facade to protect her true assets from your parents. Beatrice was the sole controller of an anonymous blind trust. Over the last 50 years, she quietly acquired the ground leases for 40% of the downtown commercial district. My jaw dropped. As an urban planner, I knew exactly what a ground lease was. It is the most powerful and ruthless tool in commercial real estate. You do not own the building itself. You own the dirt beneath it. The developers build their massive skyscrapers and luxury shopping centers on your land, and they pay you millions in rent every year just for the privilege of sitting on your dirt. If they ever default on their payments, or if the lease expires, you legally take ownership of everything built on top of your land. Precisely, Arthur smiled. Beatrice held the dirt under corporate banks, luxury hotels, and high-end retail centers. Because it was locked in a blind trust, no one knew she was the supreme landlord. She collected the commercial rent, reinvested it, and grew the portfolio in absolute secrecy away from your father's grasping hands. The total valuation of the trust as of this morning is $400 million. And as the sole named beneficiary of the Beatrice Family Trust, you are now the legal owner of every single parcel. I could not breathe. $400 million. While my parents berated me for my modest salary, while Brittany mocked my practical clothes, while Jamal treated me like an uneducated peasant, my grandmother had been securing my ultimate future. She had watched my family belittle me day after day, and she had quietly handed me the keys to the entire city. Arthur noticed my absolute shock and gave me a moment to process the astronomical numbers. He opened the portfolio to reveal a massive fold-out map of the downtown grid. These are your holdings, Quinn. The red shaded areas represent the parcels you currently own outright. The blue shaded areas represent active ground leases held by corporate developers. I suggest you familiarize yourself with your new territory. I leaned over the desk, my urban planner instincts instantly overriding my emotional shock. I had spent years analyzing this exact city grid for the municipal government. I knew the complex zoning overlays, the traffic density patterns, the underground infrastructure pipelines. I traced the grid lines with my trembling finger, my eyes flying across the colored blocks. I recognized the financial sector, the historic preservation district, the newly approved commercial zone. Then my finger stopped dead in its tracks. I froze, staring at a massive cluster of blue-shaded blocks right in the heart of the most valuable development zone in the city. I recognized those exact survey coordinates instantly. I had been reviewing the city zoning proposals for that specific area just last week. Arthur, I said, my voice dropping to an urgent whisper. This section right here, this cluster of 6 prime blocks. Who currently holds the ground lease for this land? Arthur flipped through a stack of thick legal documents and pulled out a specific file with a red tab. Ah, yes, that is a very old commercial lease. It was originally signed 40 years ago by a defunct logistics company. It was recently acquired by a highly aggressive new development group, a company called Apex Horizons. They have been desperately trying to contact the anonymous landlord to negotiate renewal terms, but we have ignored them per your grandmother's strict instructions. Apex Horizons. That was Jamal's firm, the same firm that my parents were illegally evicting me from my apartment to help fund. The same firm that Jamal claimed was building a billion-dollar legacy to secure our family name in the history books. He does not own the land. I whispered, the realization hitting me like a freight train. Jamal's entire mega-complex, the highly publicized project he has been bragging about to the local press, the project my parents are draining their new inheritance to invest in. He is building the entire thing on my land. Arthur adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. That is absolutely correct. Apex Horizons only owns the development rights to the proposed structures. You own the earth beneath them. Furthermore, Arthur continued, tapping a specific highlighted clause in the heavy contract. Because this is a legacy lease, it does not have an automatic commercial renewal clause. I looked up at Arthur, my mind connecting the dots with terrifying speed. When does the ground lease expire? Arthur checked the date at the top of the page. Today is the 15th. The lease on that entire 6-block radius expires in exactly 30 days. If a new lease is not negotiated and signed by the anonymous landlord before that strict deadline, Apex Horizons forfeits all development rights. Everything they have built, every municipal permit they have filed, and every single dollar they have invested legally transfers directly to you. The weight of Arthur Winston's words settled over me like a heavy velvet cloak. Everything Jamal had built, every single dollar my parents were funneling into his hollow empire, sat precariously on land that legally belonged to me. I thanked Arthur, secured a secondary burner phone he provided for our private communications regarding the trust, and walked back out into the rainy city streets. The cold wind no longer bothered me. I felt an entirely new sensation burning in my chest. Absolute power. My personal cell phone rang harshly, breaking my concentration. The screen flashed with a picture of my mother. I answered it, fully expecting another aggressive demand regarding my rent-controlled apartment. Get to Mastro's Steakhouse in 20 minutes. My mother commanded, her voice cutting through the background noise of clinking glasses and loud laughter. Jamal is hosting a celebratory dinner for the family. We have a business proposition for you. Do not wear those awful orthopedic work shoes, Quinn. Try to look like you belong with us. She hung up before I could reply. A business proposition. The irony was almost too rich. I hailed a cab and headed toward the upscale restaurant district, my mind turning over the master portfolio map I had just memorized. When I arrived at the steakhouse, the hostess escorted me to an exclusive private dining room in the back. My family was already halfway through their first bottles of vintage Cabernet. Jamal sat at the head of the table like a reigning monarch, his designer suit perfectly pressed. His charismatic smile flashed at the passing waitstaff as they served expensive cuts of meat. Brittany sat next to him, draped in a new fur coat she clearly bought with her freshly deposited inheritance money. My parents flanked them looking flushed and triumphant. "You are late," my father grumbled as I took the only empty seat at the far end of the table, far away from the center of attention. "I had an appointment," I replied smoothly, placing my purse on the floor. Brittany rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly enough for the waiters to hear. "What kind of appointment does a city zoning clerk have?" "An emergency sewer inspection." "Let me guess, a raccoon got stuck in a drain pipe." Jamal held up a hand, silencing his wife with a practiced, magnanimous gesture. "Now, Brittany, let us be kind to your sister. We actually need her unique expertise tonight." Jamal reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. He flicked his wrist, sending it sliding across the polished mahogany table. It stopped perfectly on top of my empty dinner plate. I looked down. It was a cashier's check made out to me for $10,000. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral. "Consider it a consulting fee." Jamal smiled, leaning back and swirling the red wine in his crystal glass. "My mega-complex project hit a slight bureaucratic snag. We start foundation demolition next week, but the City Environmental Board flagged the site for severe soil contamination. Something about old industrial chemicals from the 1980s. I stared at him, my professional training kicking in. "You are talking about federal hazard waivers, Jamal. The Environmental Protection Agency requires a massive cleanup protocol before anyone can break ground on contaminated soil. It takes months of mitigation and costs millions of dollars." "Exactly," Jamal snapped his fingers and pointed at me. "Millions I am not going to waste. Months I do not have to spare." That is where my favorite sister-in-law comes in. You work in the municipal zoning office. You have the administrative login credentials to bypass the environmental review queue. I need you to go into the system tomorrow morning, approve the hazard waiver, and rubber stamp the demolition permits. He wanted me to commit federal wire fraud and environmental endangerment. He wanted me to poison the city's groundwater just so he could meet his construction deadlines. I pushed the check back toward the center of the table. "I cannot do that. It is highly illegal. If those chemicals leach into the water supply during excavation, innocent people will get sick. I would be disbarred from the Planning Commission and sent to federal prison." My father slammed his heavy fist on the table, rattling the fine silverware. "Stop being so dramatic, Quinn. It is a victimless crime. You just click a few buttons on a computer and the problem goes away." "It is a federal offense, Dad," I repeated, stunned by his blatant disregard for the law. "Take the 10 grand. "Quinn," my father sneered, his face turning a blotchy red with anger. "It is more than you make in 6 months. Do something useful for this family for once in your miserable life." We just handed Jamal $2 million from our inheritance to secure our VIP equity in this complex. You are not going to ruin our investment because of some stupid environmental red tape. I looked at my mother, hoping for a shred of reason. Instead, she took a delicate sip of her wine and sighed heavily. "Your father is right, Quinn. You have always been so selfish. When Brittany wanted her destination wedding in Santorini, we had to drain your college fund to pay for it because family sacrifices for family. Now Jamal is building a legacy that will elevate the entire family name, and you are whining about soil. Just sign the waiver. You owe us." "I owe you nothing," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You stole my tuition money so Brittany could take Instagram photos on a yacht. Now you want me to risk federal prison time so Jamal can build a toxic hazard on a property he does not even own." Jamal's eyes narrowed instantly. "What are you talking about?" "I own the development rights." "Development rights are not land ownership," I countered, testing the waters, watching the arrogant facade slip for just a fraction of a second. "The ground lease on that entire sector is controlled by a blind trust. You are building a billion-dollar fantasy on borrowed dirt." Brittany slammed her manicured hands on the table. "How dare you speak to my husband like that? He is a financial genius. You are just a jealous, bitter spinster who lives in a rat-infested apartment. Take the money and do your job, or we will ruin you." I looked at the $10,000 check sitting on the table. It was a pathetic bribe, a literal drop in the bucket compared to the $400 million empire I now controlled. I picked up the check, Jamal smiled smugly, assuming I had finally broken under the weight of my family's relentless bullying. Good girl, Jamal said. I knew you would finally see reason. I held the paper between my fingers. Then in one swift motion I tore it perfectly in half. I tore the halves again, reducing his bribe to confetti. I reached across the table and dropped the shredded pieces directly into Jamal's expensive glass of red wine. I do not take bribes to break federal law, I said, maintaining absolute eye contact with him. And I certainly do not take orders from a glorified con artist wearing a cheap suit. The private dining room went completely silent. My parents sat with their mouths hanging open in sheer disbelief. Brittany gasped, clutching her pearls in dramatic shock. Jamal did not yell. He did not throw a tantrum. Instead, his charismatic, charming mask completely dissolved, revealing the ruthless, cold-blooded predator hiding underneath. He leaned slowly across the table, invading my personal space, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet hiss. You think you are so righteous, Quinn. You think your little government job protects you. He tilted his head, his dark eyes locked onto mine with pure malice. By tomorrow, you will not have a job to care about. The morning sun glared through the blinds of my cubicle at the municipal zoning department. Jamal thought his threat at the steakhouse would paralyze me with fear. He expected me to cower at my desk, waiting for the axe to fall. He severely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. I was not waiting for his strike. I was launching my own. I picked up my secure burner phone and dialed Arthur Winston. The line clicked open immediately. Good morning, Quinn, Arthur said. His voice was brisk and professional. I assume you are ready to proceed with the Apex Horizons lease. I pulled up Jamal's project file on my computer monitor. Yes. Jamal expects a smooth renewal of his ground lease so he can break ground on his toxic mega complex. I want you to officially inform him that the anonymous landlord is altering the terms. Issue an immediate rent increase of 300% effective upon the expiration date. Arthur let out a low chuckle. A severe hike. Apex Horizons will hemorrhage capital just trying to maintain the land rights. That is just the beginning, I instructed. Invoke the environmental safeguard clause in the original contract. Demand a full independent Phase 2 environmental audit of the soil. Make it clear that no lease renewal will even be considered until a third-party firm clears the site of all hazardous industrial chemicals. Send the legal notice by priority courier directly to Jamal's executive suite. Consider it done, Arthur replied. It will be on his desk within the hour. I hung up and returned to my zoning reports. The trap was set. For the first time in my life, I held the absolute upper hand over the people who had treated me like a stepping stone. I did not have to wait long to see the results. Exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes later, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against my desk. The caller ID flashed with Brittany's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen to answer. Before I could even say hello, Brittany's hysterical shrieking pierced my eardrum. Quinn, we have a massive emergency. You need to drop whatever useless paperwork you are doing and listen to me. I leaned back in my cheap office chair, maintaining a perfectly level tone. Good morning, Brittany. What seems to be the problem? Jamal is losing his mind. Brittany hyperventilated. Some faceless corporate holding company just sent a legal notice to his office. They own the dirt under his project site, and they just tripled the ground rent. Worse, they are demanding a multi-million-dollar toxic soil audit by next Friday. If Jamal does not show proof of capital to cover the new rent and the audit, they are going to revoke his development rights entirely. That sounds like a terrible business oversight on Jamal's part, I said calmly. Perhaps he should have secured the land before spending millions on architectural renderings. Do not give me your sarcastic attitude, Brittany snapped. This is a family crisis. Mom and Dad already wired Jamal the last $2 million of their liquid inheritance yesterday to secure his construction crew. They maxed out the equity on their house. We need immediate liquidity to prove to this anonymous landlord that Apex Horizons is solvent. I failed to see how Jamal's lack of liquidity was my problem, but Brittany was already pivoting to her true objective. You have excellent credit, Quinn, she ordered, her voice shifting from panic to absolute entitlement. You have zero debt because your lifestyle is so pathetic and cheap. Jamal ran the numbers. You need to go to the bank on your lunch break and take out a maximum capacity personal loan. Take out a second loan against your pension. Transfer every single cent to Jamal's holding account by 3 o'clock today. I stared at the wall of my cubicle. The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. You want me to take out massive personal loans to bail out your husband's failing project? It is not failing, Brittany shrieked. It is a temporary cash flow issue. You owe this family, Quinn. It is your turn to step up and make a sacrifice. I owe you nothing, I stated flatly. You owe me everything. Brittany sneered, dropping the frantic victim act and revealing the spoiled bully underneath. Do not play innocent with me. Remember when you got accepted to that out-of-state university? Mom and Dad completely emptied your college savings account to pay for my destination wedding in Santorini. They literally handed me your tuition money to pay for my first-class flights and my custom floral arrangements. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I had worked 3 jobs in high school to contribute to that fund, only to watch my parents drain it to zero. When I confronted them, they told me Brittany's society wedding was a guaranteed return on investment for the family name, while my degree was a dead end. I had been forced to attend a local community college while Brittany drank champagne on the Aegean Sea. They took your money because my future actually mattered, Brittany continued, her voice dripping with venom. You did not even need a real degree for your little civil servant job anyway. Mom and Dad invested in the golden child. Now Jamal is the golden goose. Go to the bank, Quinn. Sign the loan papers or I swear to God we will make your life a living hell. I let her finish her rant. I let the silence hang on the line for 3 long seconds. Your wedding in Santorini was a terrible investment, Brittany, I said quietly. And so is your husband. I am not giving you a single dime. I pulled the phone away from my ear as Brittany let out a blood-curdling scream of rage. I tapped the red end call button, cutting her off completely. I placed the phone face down on my desk. A profound sense of victory washed over me. I had finally drawn a line in the sand. I had finally told my toxic family no. The feeling of empowerment was intoxicating. I turned back to my computer monitor, ready to dive into my afternoon urban planning reports, with a renewed sense of purpose. But my triumph was brutally short-lived. My desk extension phone rang, a harsh, jarring sound that cut through the low hum of the zoning department. I picked up the receiver. Quinn, a stern voice barked through the speaker. It was Director Evans, the head of the municipal planning department. Yes, Director Evans, I replied. Get into my office right now, he demanded, and bring a box for your personal items. I clutched the yellowed envelope tightly against my soaked blouse. The address Winston provided led me to the financial district, specifically to a towering fortress of black glass and steel that dominated the skyline. I walked through the revolving doors, shivering as the severe air conditioning hit my rain-drenched clothes. Security was tighter than a Federal Reserve Bank. 2 armed guards checked my identification against a private manifest before escorting me to an express elevator that possessed only a single button. The doors glided open on the penthouse floor, revealing an office space that felt more like a modern art museum than a wealth management firm. The walls were paneled in rich dark walnut, and the floors were polished slate. There were no busy clerks, no ringing phones, just a profound, heavily guarded silence. A man stood waiting for me at the center of the reception area. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair neatly styled. He projected an aura of absolute authority and discretion. He did not look at my wet clothes or my scuffed shoes with the contempt my family always did. Instead, he looked at me with deep, unwavering respect. Welcome, Quinn, he said, his voice a rich, resonant baritone. I am Attorney Winston. I have managed your grandmother Beatrice's private affairs for the last 30 years. It is an honor to finally meet you in person. I stood there, rainwater dripping from my hem onto his immaculate floor. I do not understand. I admitted, my voice trembling slightly from the cold and the shock. My parents just signed papers downstairs at their lawyer's office. They transferred millions into their personal accounts. They told me my grandmother left me nothing but this phone number. My sister Brittany laughed in my face and said it was a cruel joke. Winston offered a sharp, knowing smile. Beatrice was many things, but she was never cruel to you. She was a master tactician. She knew exactly who her son was, and she knew the depths of your mother's greed. She knew that if she left her true wealth exposed, your parents would bleed it dry to fund their vanity, and they would leave you with absolutely nothing. So she created a brilliant diversion. He gestured for me to follow him into a massive corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the entire city grid below. He motioned for me to sit in a plush leather chair across from a desk carved from a single slab of marble. The money your parents received today, the suburban real estate, the liquid cash accounts, that was the distraction money, Winston explained, pouring me a cup of hot tea from a silver pot. She left them just enough to keep them arrogant, satisfied, and entirely oblivious. Oblivious to what I asked, wrapping my cold hands around the warm porcelain teacup. Winston unlocked a heavy steel drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. He placed it squarely in front of me. Oblivious to the empire, Winston said softly. Your grandmother was not a poor woman surviving on a modest pension and baking cookies in a duplex. That was a carefully constructed cover story. For the past 50 years, Beatrice was the anonymous controller of the Vanguard Blind Trust. Through shell companies and proxy acquisitions, she systematically purchased the ground leases for the downtown commercial district. My breath caught in my throat. As an urban planner, I dealt with commercial zoning every single day. I knew the devastating power of a ground lease. In commercial real estate, developers rarely own the land they build on. They lease the dirt, build their massive skyscrapers, and pay exorbitant annual rent to the landowner. If a developer defaults on a ground lease, or if the lease expires without renewal, the landowner legally seizes ownership of everything built on top of that dirt. Are you telling me my grandmother owned commercial dirt? I whispered, staring at the thick ledger. Winston nodded, his eyes gleaming with professional pride. She did not just own dirt, Quinn. She owned the most valuable dirt in the state. She held the ground leases beneath corporate banking headquarters, luxury shopping pavilions, and international hotel chains. She collected the commercial rent, reinvested it with absolute secrecy, and compounded her wealth in the shadows. The total valuation of the Vanguard Blind Trust as of this morning is roughly $400 million. The room seemed to spin. $400 million. My family had spent my entire life treating me like a pathetic burden. My father called me a failure because I chose public service over corporate greed. Brittany laughed at my modest apartment while spending my stolen college fund on designer handbags. Jamal treated me like an uneducated peasant. And all the while, the grandmother who held my hand, who listened to my dreams, had been quietly locking down the city to hand it to me. Because the trust was entirely blind, Winston continued, bypassing the probate courts completely. Your family has absolutely no legal claim to it. They cannot touch it. They cannot contest it. The empire is now solely yours, Quinn. You are the supreme landlord. I reached out with trembling fingers and opened the leather ledger. Inside was a master portfolio map of the downtown grid. It was an exact replica of the zoning maps I stared at every day in my municipal cubicle, but this one was covered in territorial markings. Large sections of the city were highlighted in crimson ink. My urban planner instincts instantly kicked into overdrive. The shock began to recede, replaced by a sharp, analytical clarity. My mind automatically filtered the highlighted sectors, identifying traffic density, commercial valuation, and underground municipal infrastructure pipelines. I traced the crimson grid lines with my index finger, moving past the historic preservation district, past the financial center, and down toward the newly rezoned commercial harbor sector. My finger stopped abruptly. I stared at a massive 6-block cluster of crimson highlight right in the heart of the harbor district. The blood rushed out of my face. I recognized these exact survey coordinates. I had just reviewed the municipal demolition permits and environmental hazard reports for this specific sector yesterday afternoon. Winston, I said, my voice barely a whisper as I tapped the 6-block radius on the map. This specific cluster, who currently holds the active development lease for this ground. Winston adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and opened a supplementary file folder on his desk. Ah, yes. That is a highly aggressive legacy lease. It was originally signed decades ago, but the development rights were recently acquired by a new high-leverage real estate fund, a company called Apex Horizons. They have been desperately trying to contact the anonymous landlord for the past 6 months to negotiate renewal terms, but per your grandmother's strict instructions, we have blocked all communication. Apex Horizons. My stomach plummeted, then instantly soared with a dizzying rush of adrenaline. Apex Horizons was Jamal's firm, the same firm that was illegally breaking my apartment lease to demolish my building. The same firm that my parents had just blindly dumped their $2 million inheritance into to secure VIP equity. Jamal had been parading around the city bragging to the press about his billion-dollar mega complex, claiming it would cement our family's legacy. He does not own the land? I said, a slow, dangerous realization forming in my mind. Jamal's entire mega project, the foundation, the architecture, the municipal permits. He is building his empire on my dirt. That is correct. Winston smiled, a sharp, predatory glint in his eye. He only owns the right to build. You own the earth he stands on, and because this is a legacy contract, there is no automatic commercial renewal clause. He is entirely at your mercy. I looked back down at the map, my mind calculating the municipal timeline. When does Jamal's ground lease expire? Winston looked at his gold watch, then back to me. The original contract dictates a strict expiration. If a new lease is not signed by the anonymous landlord, Apex Horizons forfeits all development rights, and every structure on that land legally defaults to you. The lease expires in exactly 30 days. I grabbed a cardboard copy paper box from the supply closet and walked down the fluorescent-lit hallway. My heart hammered a steady rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were completely still. I pushed open the frosted glass door to Director Evans' corner suite. Jamal was sitting in the plush leather guest chair. He had his legs crossed at the knee, exposing his designer socks. He was sipping an espresso and looking entirely too comfortable. Director Evans sat behind his massive mahogany desk, sweating profusely and refusing to make eye contact with me. "Close the door," Quinn Director Evans muttered, shuffling a stack of reprimand forms. "Effective immediately. Your employment with the city planning department is terminated." I placed my empty cardboard box on the floor. On what grounds? Gross insubordination and the targeted harassment of a major city developer, Evans recited mechanically, his eyes fixed firmly on his blotter. "Mr. Blackwood filed a formal complaint this afternoon, stating you demanded illegal bribes in exchange for expediting his environmental waivers. The department has a zero-tolerance policy for corruption." I looked at Jamal. He offered a slow, predatory smile. He had flipped the narrative entirely. He was accusing me of the exact crime he had committed at the steakhouse just 12 hours earlier. But I knew this was not just about a fabricated complaint. Jamal did not leave things to chance. "How much did he pay you?" I asked Evans, my voice ringing with absolute clarity in the quiet room. "How large was the untraceable donation Apex Horizons just made to your municipal discretionary fund to buy this termination?" Evans turned a violent shade of crimson. "Turn in your municipal badge and your security keys immediately. Security will escort you off the premises." I did not argue. Arguing with a bought man is a waste of oxygen. I unclipped my lanyard and dropped it onto his desk with a sharp clack. I picked up my box and turned toward the door. Jamal stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He moved into my personal space, blocking my exit. He leaned down until his mouth was inches from my ear. The smell of his expensive cologne was suffocating. "Now you have absolutely nothing," Jamal whispered, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "No job, no leverage, no future. You played a stupid game and you lost. Come to my mansion tomorrow morning and beg for a job as my personal assistant, or I will make sure you are permanently blacklisted from every urban planning firm in this state. You will be serving coffee at a diner for the rest of your pathetic life." I stepped around him without saying a single word. I walked out of the municipal building and stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The afternoon sky was bruised and gray. I took the subway back to my neighborhood, my mind racing with strategies. I needed to update Arthur Winston on Jamal's latest desperate maneuvers. If Jamal was burning through cash to bribe city officials, the 300% rent hike was going to crush him faster than I anticipated. I turned the corner onto my street and stopped dead in my tracks. A white commercial van was parked illegally in front of my apartment building. The side of the van read Metro Locksmith Services. Standing on the sidewalk, shivering in the cold afternoon wind, were my parents. My father Richard stood holding a large black umbrella over my mother Patricia. Sitting in a pathetic pile on the wet concrete were 6 heavy black trash bags. My entire life shoved into garbage bags and tossed onto the street. I walked slowly toward them, dropping my empty office box onto the pavement. My father spotted me and his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He stepped forward, pointing a thick finger at my face. "Failures do not get free rides." My father sneered, his voice echoing down the quiet residential street. "We executed an immediate emergency eviction. We legally own this unit, and we are liquidating the property today. We need the cash liquidity to support Jamal. Some anonymous corporate parasite is squeezing his development project, and family protects family." "You illegally locked me out of my home without a 30-day notice," I said, staring at the black trash bags soaking up the puddle water. "I have a signed lease." "Sue us," my mother snapped, stepping out from under the umbrella. "Oh, wait, you cannot afford a lawyer." Jamal called us from his car. "We know you were fired for gross misconduct today. You are a disgrace to the Wilson name. We warned you to sign those environmental waivers, and you chose to be difficult. Now you are homeless." My father kicked one of the trash bags with his expensive leather shoe. "You are going to sleep on the concrete until you learn to respect your brother-in-law. He is the only one bringing wealth into this family. You will have nothing until you submit to his authority." They stared at me, waiting for the breakdown. They expected me to fall to my knees. They wanted the tears, the hysterical begging, the desperate apologies. They wanted to watch me shatter so they could feel powerful. Instead, I looked at the wet trash bags, and a profound, chilling realization washed over me. Jamal was desperate. He was paying off city officials and forcing my parents to liquidate minor assets just to stay afloat. But if I stayed on the outside, I would never see the internal financial rot of Apex Horizons. I would never find the paper trail proving he was committing federal fraud. To completely dismantle a corrupt empire, you have to plant explosives from the inside. I needed unrestricted access to his files, his emails, and his private schedules. I needed to be his shadow. I looked back at my parents. Slowly, a wide, genuine smile spread across my face. My mother took a hesitant step backward, clearly unnerved by my reaction. My father frowned, his arrogant posture faltering slightly. I bent down and grabbed the straps of my single canvas duffel bag, leaving the rest of the garbage bags on the wet street. I threw the heavy bag over my shoulder and stood up straight. I looked my father directly in the eye, channeling every ounce of absolute authority I possessed. "Tell Jamal I will be at his office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to start as his assistant," I said, my voice cutting through the cold air like a blade. I turned my back on them and walked down the sidewalk. Behind me, I heard my father let out a loud, booming laugh. I knew they were exchanging triumphant glances. They were smiling because they thought they had finally broken me. They thought they had forced the family disappointment into total submission. They had no idea they had just invited the Trojan horse directly through their front gates. The Apex Horizons headquarters occupied the entire top floor of a sleek glass high-rise in the financial district. I walked through the heavy double doors at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. The reception area was a vulgar display of newly acquired wealth, featuring imported Italian marble floors, brass fixtures, and a massive water wall displaying the company logo. Jamal was waiting for me in the lobby. He wore a bespoke navy suit and a triumphant grin that stretched from ear to ear. He held a ceramic cup of espresso, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "I knew you would crawl back," Jamal said, his voice echoing in the cavernous lobby. "Reality is a harsh teacher, Quinn. It is time you learned your place." I kept my face perfectly blank. "I am here to work, Jamal." He chuckled, a dark, condescending sound. "Follow me, assistant." Jamal paraded me through the center of the bustling open-plan office. Dozens of junior analysts, architects, and project managers typed frantically at their dual monitors. Jamal stopped in the middle of the floor and clapped his hands loudly. "Listen up, everyone!" Jamal announced, his voice booming over the sound of ringing phones. "This is my wife's sister Quinn. She had a little trouble hacking it in the real world, so we are doing our family duty and taking her in as my new personal assistant. If you need coffee fetched, copies made, or lunch picked up, just hand it to Quinn. She is here to serve." A few sycophantic executives laughed. The junior staff exchanged uncomfortable glances but quickly looked back down at their screens. Jamal pointed to a tiny, cramped desk pushed flush against the side of the main copy machine. "There is your office," he sneered. "Your first task is to organize the physical mail, sort the contractor invoices, and lie to anyone who calls asking for payment. Tell them the checks are in the mail. If you mess this up, you are back on the street." I sat down at the minuscule desk, the hum of the copy machine vibrating against my shoulder. I nodded submissively. "Yes, Jamal. I will get right on it." He smiled, utterly convinced he had broken my spirit, and walked into his massive corner office. For the next 3 hours, I played the part of the defeated, humiliated sister-in-law flawlessly. I sorted paper clips. I filed irate notices from unpaid cement suppliers, mentally noting the desperate lack of cash flow Jamal was trying to hide. I smiled meekly at the executives who handed me empty coffee mugs. Because I appeared utterly defeated, I became entirely invisible. And invisibility is the greatest asset a spy can possess. At 11 o'clock, the elevator chimed, and Brittany stepped onto the executive floor. She wore designer sunglasses indoors and a pristine white cashmere coat. She carried a plastic grocery bag in one hand and her designer purse in the other. She bypassed the receptionist and marched directly to my cramped desk by the copier. Several senior partners stopped their conversations to watch the spectacle. Brittany loved an audience. She dropped the plastic bag directly onto my keyboard. "These are Jamal's sweaty gym clothes from this morning," Brittany commanded, her voice pitched loud enough for the entire bullpen to hear. "Take them to the luxury dry cleaner on Fifth Avenue. Do not wrinkle them on the subway. And while you are out, get me an iced latte with almond milk, 2 pumps of sugar-free vanilla, and exactly 4 ice cubes. If it is watered down by the time you get back, I will pour it on your head." I looked up at my sister. The golden child was glowing with toxic satisfaction. She had spent her whole life competing with me, and now she finally had me functioning as her personal servant in front of a corporate audience. I stood up and picked up the bag of dirty gym clothes. "Right away, Brittany," she laughed, turning to a nearby vice president. "See what happens when people finally learn to respect family hierarchy. I told you she just needed a little tough love." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and walked toward the elevators. I did exactly as she asked. I dropped off the laundry. I bought the ridiculous coffee. But I used the 45 minutes away from the office to step into a quiet alleyway and use my encrypted burner phone. I called Arthur Winston's private security team. They provided me with a specific sequence of IP configurations to bypass commercial firewalls, along with a discrete black USB drive hidden in a hollowed-out pen. When I returned to the office, I placed the perfectly chilled latte on Brittany's desk in the visitor lounge. She did not even look up from her magazine. I returned to my spot by the copy machine. While the office ignored the lowly assistant, I went to work. I had spent years analyzing municipal infrastructure and secure government zoning networks. Navigating a private commercial server was child's play by comparison. Using the administrative credentials Jamal had carelessly assigned me to manage his calendar, I began mapping the firm's internal network architecture. I traced the data pathways, I identified the main server clusters, I found the financial ledgers he was actively keeping off the official books. I noticed his terrible security habits. He used the same Wi-Fi protocol for his private executive suite as he did for the guest lounge. At exactly 1 o'clock, Jamal emerged from his office. He tossed a $20 bill onto my desk. "I want a dry-aged steak salad from the Chop House 6 blocks down," he barked. "I have an emergency closed-door meeting with the Environmental Review Board in the main conference room. I will be away from my desk for exactly 45 minutes. Have my food waiting for me when I get back, and do not forget the balsamic vinaigrette this time." He turned and walked toward the glass-walled conference room at the far end of the floor. He left his heavy oak office door cracked open. I took the $20 bill and walked directly to the receptionist. I handed her the money and an extra 50 from my own pocket. I told her I was feeling faint and asked if she could order the salad through a delivery app to save me the walk. She happily agreed, pocketing the extra cash. That bought me exactly 30 minutes of unsupervised time. I waited until the bullpen was distracted by a loud conference call on the main floor. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and glided silently into Jamal's massive corner office. I pulled the heavy oak door shut until the latch clicked softly into place. I pulled the blinds down, shielding the room from the main floor. I approached his massive dual monitor setup. The screensaver was bouncing a generic corporate logo. I pulled the black USB drive from my pocket and slid it into the hidden port on the back of the tower. The screens woke up instantly, demanding an administrative password. I typed his wedding anniversary. Denied. I typed his birthday. Denied. I smiled, remembering the sheer depth of his arrogance. I typed the name of his company and the current year. Apex Horizons 2026. The security prompt vanished. Access granted. The Winston security drive immediately went to work, masking my digital footprint and bypassing the secondary firewalls. I navigated through his mapped server, ignoring the standard architectural renderings and fake financial projections he showed his investors. I dug deep into the hidden encrypted partitions on his local drive. I scrolled past dozens of generic folders until my eyes caught a specific directory buried at the very bottom of the tree. It was heavily restricted, flagged with a red digital lock icon, and titled simply Project Legacy. I double-clicked the folder. The screen flickered, loading a massive cache of documents. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the titles of the files, and the true horrifying scale of Jamal's crimes finally stared back at me. The screen illuminated my face with the stark blue glow of dozens of nested spreadsheets and PDF documents. My eyes darted across the digital files, scanning the data with the trained precision of a senior municipal planner. I opened the first subfolder labeled City Permits. It was a complete fabrication. As someone who had processed thousands of commercial zoning waivers, I recognized the discrepancies instantly. The municipal seal on the demolition permit was an outdated version retired by the city council 3 years ago. The signature of the chief environmental inspector was a clumsy digital copy pixelated around the edges. The geological soil reports were not even from our district. Jamal had copy-pasted a generic topography survey from a completely different development in another state and slapped the Apex Horizons logo on the header. He did not have a single legitimate permit to break ground. The billion-dollar mega-complex he had been parading around the local news was a phantom. There were no steel shipments ordered. There were no union construction crews retained. The architectural renderings he had shown my parents were cheap, high-resolution stock images purchased online and lightly modified. My fingers flew across the keyboard, opening the master financial ledger. If there was no actual construction, where was the money going? The reality was worse than a simple embezzlement scheme. It was a textbook catastrophic Ponzi structure. I tracked the incoming capital. Dozens of wealthy local investors, including my parents, had wired massive sums of liquidity into the primary Apex Horizons holding account. But the money did not sit there, and it certainly did not go toward development costs. It was immediately fractured and rerouted. I found the exact ledger entry for my parents. Yesterday afternoon, Richard and Patricia had wired $2.5 million, the absolute totality of their liquid inheritance and the borrowed equity from their house. The transaction timestamp showed the money hitting Jamal's account at 2 o'clock. By 2:30, the entire sum was gone. Jamal had wired $1 million to a shadow LLC registered in the Cayman Islands. He routed another $800,000 to a series of aggressive private equity lenders, dangerous shadow banks that charged predatory interest rates. The rest of my parents' money was sliced into smaller $50,000 payments and sent directly to the earliest investors of Apex Horizons, disguised as quarterly dividend returns. He was bleeding his newest victims dry just to keep the oldest victims from calling the authorities. Apex Horizons was a hollow shell, a desperate, churning vacuum of debt. Jamal was not a visionary developer. He was a cornered rat borrowing millions from dangerous people to keep up the facade of extreme wealth, and he was using my family as his personal piggy bank. I glanced at the clock on the bottom corner of the monitor. I had been in the office for 12 minutes. I clicked the application for the Winston security drive and initiated a full encrypted mirror download of the entire Project Legacy directory. A thin gray progress bar appeared on the screen. 10%, 20%. My heart slammed against my ribs. The sheer volume of federal fraud contained in these files was staggering. When these documents saw the light of day, Jamal would not just face a civil eviction from the commercial ground lease. He would be indicted for wire fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. He would face decades in a federal penitentiary. 50%, 60%. I listened to the muffled sounds of the office through the heavy oak door, the low murmur of phone calls, the clatter of the copy machine. I kept my eyes glued to the progress bar. I needed every single ledger, every fake permit, every offshore routing number. 80%, 90%. Suddenly, the sharp, distinct sound of Jamal's booming voice echoed from the hallway just outside the suite. He was supposed to be gone for 45 minutes, but the heavy footfalls approaching the door told me the environmental review meeting had ended abruptly. He was walking fast, and he was angry. The progress bar flashed green. Download complete. I yanked the black USB drive from the back of the computer tower. I shoved it deep into the pocket of my skirt. I grabbed the wireless mouse and rapidly clicked out of the hidden partitions, collapsing the folders until the screen returned to the generic corporate logo screensaver. The brass doorknob turned. I lunged away from the executive desk, dropping to my knees just as the heavy oak door swung violently open. Jamal froze in the doorway. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie slightly loosened. His eyes locked onto me, crouching beside his private desk, far away from my assigned spot by the copy machine. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. The smug, arrogant brother-in-law was gone, replaced by a cornered, dangerous predator. "What the hell are you doing in my office?" Jamal demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible. I started injecting a perfect note of pathetic stammering into my voice. Jamal crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He reached out and grabbed my wrist, his fingers biting into my skin with brutal, bruising force. He jerked my arm upward, twisting it slightly, pulling me flush against the edge of the mahogany desk. His eyes darted to his computer monitors, checking the screens before snapping back to my face. "I asked you a question, Quinn," he hissed, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "What are you looking at? You have zero authorization to cross this threshold. If you are spying on my equipment, I will break your arm." My pulse roared in my ears, but I forced my eyes to well up with tears. I let my shoulders slump, playing the terrified, submissive victim. With my free hand, I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a crumpled yellow piece of paper. I shoved it against his chest. "Brittany told me to bring this to you," I whimpered, letting my voice crack perfectly. Jamal snatched the paper from my hand, his grip on my wrist loosening just enough for me to pull away. He looked down at the slip. It was the dry cleaning receipt for his gym clothes. "She said you needed the claim ticket for your expense reports," I lied, rubbing my wrist and keeping my eyes cast downward. "I came in to put it on your keyboard so it would not get lost." I dropped my pen and was looking for it under the desk. Jamal stared at the receipt, then stared at me. He looked back at his computer screens. The generic bouncing logo revealed nothing. He crumpled the receipt in his fist, his jaw working furiously as he weighed my pathetic explanation against his own paranoia. "Get out," he ordered, pointing toward the door. "You do not enter this office unless you are invited. You do not touch my desk. You do not breathe my air. Get back to the copy machine where you belong." "Yes, Jamal," I whispered, keeping my head bowed. I turned and practically ran out of the office, fleeing back to my tiny desk in the bullpen. I sat down heavily, my hands shaking as I reached into my pocket. My fingers brushed against the hard plastic casing of the USB drive. Jamal's suspicions were officially raised, but he was too arrogant to realize he had already been robbed blind. I had the keys to his destruction sitting right in my pocket, and the countdown to his absolute ruin had just begun. The heavy brass knocker on the mansion's front door echoed loudly, followed immediately by the door swinging open with alarming force. Brittany's theatrical screaming abruptly stopped. She spun around, her designer heels crunching on the broken crystal. Jamal and the enforcer stepped out of the study, both looking panicked at the sudden intrusion. Standing in the grand foyer, dripping wet from a sudden afternoon downpour, were my parents. Richard and Patricia looked frantic, their faces pale and drawn. My father was clutching a thick manila folder, his knuckles white with tension. "What is going on here?" my father demanded, taking in the scene. He looked at the shattered glass, at Brittany's furious face, and finally down at me, still kneeling in the puddle of champagne wearing my degrading uniform. Dad, Brittany, immediately pivoted, rushing toward him with outstretched arms. "It is Quinn! She is completely out of control. She tripped and destroyed the catering setup. She is ruining my brunch on purpose because she is jealous." My father ignored her. He did not even look at me. He bypassed Brittany entirely and marched directly toward Jamal. "We tried to use our debit cards to pay for a business lunch," my father said, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and fear. "They were declined. We called the bank. They told us our accounts have been frozen by a federal mandate. The teller said it was connected to suspicious wire transfers we made to Apex Horizons yesterday. Jamal, what is happening with our money?" Jamal's confident facade cracked entirely. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He shot a desperate glance at the loan shark enforcer standing behind him, then looked back at my father. "Richard, there must be a misunderstanding with the bank," Jamal stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "The Municipal Zoning Board is running a routine compliance check on the harbor project. They sometimes put temporary holds on connected accounts. I assure you your capital is completely safe." "It is not safe," my mother shrieked, stepping forward. She looked completely unhinged. Her perfect suburban composure shattered. "We called the municipal zoning office to demand answers. We spoke to Director Evans. He told us Apex Horizons does not even hold the ground lease for the harbor site. He said the lease expires in 30 days, and the anonymous landowner has initiated a toxic soil audit that will cost millions. He said your project is dead in the water." The wealthy guests in the courtyard had gone completely silent. They were edging closer to the hallway, listening to every word. These were the high society marks Jamal had been targeting, and they were currently witnessing the total unraveling of his empire. Jamal was sweating so heavily his collar was soaked. "Evans is lying," he barked, his voice rising in panic. "He is trying to shake me down for a bigger bribe. I own the development rights. The project is fully funded. We break ground next month." I slowly stood up, brushing the broken glass off my black uniform skirt. I looked at the enforcer, who was now glaring at Jamal with murderous intent. I looked at Brittany, who was slowly backing away toward the staircase, realizing the ship was going down. "Evans is not lying," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the dead silence of the foyer, it carried perfectly. Every head snapped toward me. My father glared at me, his eyes full of contempt. "Shut your mouth, Quinn," my father growled. "You are a fired homeless failure wearing a maid's costume. You know absolutely nothing about corporate finance." "I know everything about the harbor project," I replied, stepping over the shattered crystal. "I know that Apex Horizons does not have a single legitimate building permit. I know the geological surveys you submitted to the city were forged from a development in Texas. I know you used my parents' $2.5 million yesterday to pay off early investors in offshore shadow accounts." Jamal lunged toward me, his face twisted in absolute fury. "You shut your mouth right now." I did not flinch. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I tapped the screen, unlocking the device, and held it up. "I know because I downloaded your entire encrypted server this morning while you were ordering your dry-aged steak salad," I said, staring directly into Jamal's panicked eyes. "I have every fake ledger. I have every forged permit. I have the routing numbers for the Cayman Island accounts. The entire project legacy file is currently sitting on a secure drive in the hands of the State Attorney General. The silence that followed was absolute. My father looked at Jamal, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Is she telling the truth, Jamal? Did you steal our money? Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the guests watching from the courtyard. He looked at the enforcer blocking the study door. He looked at my parents, who had just realized they were utterly bankrupt. I turned my gaze to Brittany. She was frozen on the bottom step of the staircase, her face ashen. And the best part? I continued, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction, is that Brittany knew all about it. I stood in the hallway 10 minutes ago and listened to her agree to drain your remaining retirement accounts by Wednesday to pay off this gentleman right here. I gestured toward the enforcer. My mother let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She turned to look at her golden child. Brittany, tell me that is a lie. Tell me you did not conspire to steal our retirement. Brittany's mouth worked silently. She looked at Jamal, then at her parents, and finally at me. The pristine, glamorous illusion she had spent her entire life building was instantly reduced to dust. I turned my back on all of them. I untied the white starched apron and let it fall to the floor, landing softly on the broken glass. I walked toward the front door, pushing past my parents without a single glance backward. I stepped out into the pouring rain, leaving the liars and the thieves to devour each other. I had a meeting with Arthur Winston to finalize my real estate empire, and I was not going to be late. The rain plastered my hair to my face as I walked 3 blocks to a waiting black sedan. Arthur Winston had sent his personal driver. I climbed into the leather interior, the quiet hum of the engine a stark contrast to the screaming match I had just ignited in Jamal's foyer. I pulled the black USB drive from my pocket, rolling it between my fingers. This tiny piece of plastic held the weight of 100 ruined lives, and it was about to drop like an anvil. Winston's law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a historic granite building. Unlike Apex Horizons, there were no flashy logos or imported water walls. It was hushed, imposing, and smelled of lemon oil and old money. A receptionist in a sharp gray suit escorted me past a series of frosted glass doors into Winston's private corner office. Arthur Winston stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Sitting at his expansive mahogany desk was a woman I had never seen before. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, and entirely devoid of warmth. "You have the drive?" Winston asked, turning to face me. I placed it directly on the desk in front of the woman. Every file, every fabricated permit, and every hidden transaction from Jamal's private server. "Quinn, this is Special Agent Sarah Vance," Winston said, gesturing to the woman. "White-collar crime division FBI. I brought her in the moment you confirmed the offshore transfers." Agent Vance did not smile. She picked up the drive and inserted it into a standalone air-gapped laptop she had brought with her. "Let us see exactly how brazen your brother-in-law really is." For the next hour, the only sounds in the room were the furious clicking of Vance's mouse and the steady drum of rain against the window pane. I stood over her shoulder, pointing out the discrepancies I had found. I showed her the fake municipal seals on the demolition permits. I walked her through the altered geological surveys. Then I pulled up the master financial ledger. "Look at the timestamps," I said, tapping the screen. "He receives a massive wire transfer from local investors, in this case my parents, and within 30 minutes, the capital is dispersed. He routes a fraction to early investors to simulate dividend yields, pays off predatory lenders, and funnels the bulk of it into a Cayman Islands holding company." Agent Vance leaned back, rubbing her temples. "It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. He is robbing Peter to pay Paul while siphoning the excess out of the country. The sheer scale of this is staggering. We are looking at massive SEC violations, wire fraud, and grand larceny. He is looking at 20 years minimum." "Then we have enough to arrest him," I said, feeling a surge of adrenaline. Vance shook her head, her expression grim. "We have enough to open a formal federal investigation which could take months to untangle. Jamal is using a sophisticated digital wash to obscure the final destination of those Cayman transfers. We can see the money leaving domestic accounts, but we cannot see who actually owns the offshore shell companies. Without the ultimate routing numbers and ownership proofs, a smart defense attorney will claim Jamal is a victim of a bad overseas investment. We need the final link. We need the smoking gun that ties him directly to those offshore accounts. He is too arrogant to trust everything to the cloud, Winston interjected, pacing the length of the office. A man running a fraud this massive who routinely lies to everyone around him does not trust digital security. He will have a hard copy, a physical ledger. I closed my eyes, picturing Jamal's paranoid habits. I thought back to the architectural blueprints he had proudly shown off when he and Brittany were renovating their sprawling suburban mansion. As a municipal planner, I had analyzed structural voids for a living. I remembered questioning a strange 18-inch gap behind the custom vanity mirror in their master bedroom suite. Jamal had laughed it off, claiming it was for high-end plumbing access. "It is not plumbing," I said, my eyes snapping open. "It is a wall safe. He keeps a physical black leather ledger. I saw him holding it once in his study, and he nearly panicked when I walked in. He keeps it locked in the master bedroom behind Brittany's vanity mirror." Vance sat up straight. "Are you absolutely certain?" "Positive," I replied. "If the routing numbers are anywhere, they are in that book." "Then we subpoena the house," Winston said. "We get a warrant." "If you request a warrant, it tips him off," I argued. "He has contacts in the zoning board and the police department. The second a warrant is processed, someone will make a phone call. He will burn that ledger, pack his bags, and be on a private jet to a non-extradition country before your agents even reach his front gate. He already knows my parents are onto the frozen accounts. He is cornered. He is going to run." Vance tapped her pen against the desk. "She is right. He is a flight risk. But I cannot authorize an illegal search and seizure. Any evidence obtained outside the scope of a federal warrant is inadmissible in court." "It is inadmissible if a federal agent steals it," I countered, looking between Vance and Winston. "But what if a furious, recently fired family member simply walked out with it?" Winston stopped pacing. "Quinn, absolutely not. That is breaking and entering. That is burglary. I know the security layout of that house," I insisted, my voice rising with conviction. "I know the access codes to the service entrance. The Apex Horizons Charity Gala is in exactly 48 hours. Jamal and Brittany are hosting 300 people in their ballroom and courtyard. The entire property will be swarming with caterers, valet drivers, and security guards focused entirely on the perimeter and the guests. The master suite upstairs will be completely empty." Vance looked at me with a mixture of respect and intense warning. "Quinn, listen to me very carefully. If you do this, you are operating entirely outside the law. I cannot protect you. Winston cannot protect you. If Jamal catches you in his bedroom, he will call the police. You will be arrested for felony burglary. You will go to a state penitentiary. Your credibility as a whistleblower will be destroyed, and Jamal will walk free." I looked down at the rain-slicked streets of the financial district below. I thought about my parents currently standing in a puddle of champagne, realizing they had been stripped of their life savings by the golden child they had worshipped. I thought about the years of humiliation, the sneers, the maid uniform, and the absolute destruction of my own career that Jamal had orchestrated. Jamal had stolen my past, but I was not going to let him steal another dime from anyone's future. "I will get the ledger," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "I will bring you the exact routing numbers you need to freeze his offshore accounts before the gala even ends." Winston rubbed his jaw, looking deeply conflicted. "Quinn, this is a massive risk. You are talking about infiltrating a highly secure mansion during the biggest social event of the year. If you make one wrong move, one single mistake, you are going to prison." I turned away from the window and met the federal agent's stare. "I have been invisible to my family my entire life," I said. "It is time I put that skill to good use." I walked out of Arthur Winston's office with a singular, terrifying objective. The Apex Horizons Charity Gala was scheduled to begin in exactly 48 hours. Time was rapidly evaporating. If I did not secure the physical routing numbers before Jamal realized his digital server had been copied, he would vanish. I knew the schedule of the entire household. It was Friday morning. Brittany and my mother, Patricia, had an unbreakable 4-hour appointment at an elite bridal boutique downtown for their final custom gown fittings. Jamal was supposedly trapped in emergency meetings with his panicked vendors, desperately trying to keep the catering and lighting companies from walking off the job due to bounced checks. The sprawling suburban mansion was going to be completely empty. I parked my rented sedan 3 blocks away from their gated neighborhood, hiding the car behind a row of thick, mature oak trees. I pulled a plain black baseball cap low over my face and zipped up my dark jacket. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the morning air heavy and humid. I walked briskly up the winding affluent street, keeping my head down. When I reached their massive wrought iron perimeter gate, I did not even break stride. I walked around to the side of the property, slipping into the thick, overgrown privacy hedges. Jamal had fired the professional landscaping crew weeks ago to save cash, and the lack of maintenance provided the perfect cover. I reached the wooden service gate. Jamal was incredibly predictable. He used the same 4-digit code for everything that did not matter to him. I punched in the last 4 digits of his own phone number. The lock clicked, and I slipped into the backyard. The sheer scale of the property was nauseating. I moved quickly past the pristine infinity pool and the outdoor kitchen, heading straight for the rear patio doors. I reached beneath the heavy ceramic base of a massive potted fern. My mother had complained loudly about Brittany hiding a spare key under a fake rock last Thanksgiving, calling it a security risk. Brittany had simply moved it under the fern. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I grabbed the key, unlocked the patio door, and stepped inside. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the low, expensive hum of the custom climate control system. I stood in the cavernous, gleaming kitchen, my wet sneakers squeaking softly against the imported Italian marble floors. As I moved through the ground floor, navigating toward the grand staircase, I felt a sickening wave of revulsion. Everywhere I looked, I saw the physical manifestation of my parents' drained accounts. I passed the formal dining room, the massive 20-seat mahogany dining table, and the glittering 2-story crystal chandelier hanging above it. That was my father's hard-earned pension fund. I walked past the sunken living room, the custom velvet sectional, and the original modern art pieces hanging on the walls. That was the equity they had recklessly borrowed against the childhood home I grew up in. I passed the glass-walled, temperature-controlled wine cellar stocked with hundreds of vintage bottles. That was my mother's medical emergency savings. They had sacrificed their entire future, willingly marching into absolute bankruptcy, just so Brittany could play pretend in a multi-million-dollar sandbox. I shook off the anger and hurried up the sweeping grand staircase. My pulse hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached the master suite at the far end of the hallway and pushed the heavy double doors open. The room was a staggering monument to Brittany's crushing narcissism. Positioned directly above her massive custom makeup vanity was a life-sized, incredibly arrogant oil painting of Brittany herself. She was depicted wearing a flowing silk gown, gazing out over a painted balcony like some kind of royalty. I remembered my conversation with Jamal. The bizarre 18-inch gap he had tried to pass off as plumbing access. I stepped up to the vanity and ran my hands along the edges of the heavy gilded frame of the oil painting. I felt a hidden latch on the bottom right corner. I pressed it and the entire painting swung smoothly outward on concealed hinges. Hidden perfectly in the wall behind Brittany's painted face was a matte black steel safe. A flush-mounted digital keypad blinked green, demanding a 6-digit combination. I stared at the numbers, taking a deep breath to steady my shaking hands. Jamal was arrogant, but Brittany controlled this room. He would have used a number that pacified her massive ego, something she would never forget. I thought about the passwords she had used for everything since we were teenagers. It was always tied to her greatest, most vain triumph, the moment she peaked. May 14th, 2010. The day she was crowned high school prom queen. She still kept the cheap plastic tiara displayed in a glass case in the downstairs den. I raised my hand and punched the digits into the keypad. 051410. A heavy, satisfying mechanical click echoed in the quiet bedroom. The steel door popped open. I pulled the safe open. Inside, resting beneath velvet jewelry boxes and stacks of bundled emergency cash, was a thick, black leather-bound ledger. I grabbed it, flipped it open on the vanity, and pulled out my cell phone. It was the ultimate smoking gun. Pages upon pages of Jamal's frantic handwritten notes. It was a complete map of his federal wire fraud. I found the exact Cayman Island routing numbers. I found the names of the shadow LLCs registered in the Bahamas. He had documented the exact flow of the stolen money, keeping it entirely offline to avoid leaving a digital footprint. I switched my phone camera to macro mode and began snapping photos as fast as my fingers could move. Page 1. Click. Page 2. Click. I captured the offshore accounts holding my parents' money. I captured the direct deposits Jamal was funneling to the loan shark enforcers. I photographed every single routing code Arthur Winston and Agent Vance needed to freeze the assets and issue federal indictments. I reached the final page. I snapped the last photo and quickly shoved my phone back into my pocket. My hands were slick with sweat. All I had to do was put the black ledger back close the painting and walk out the service gate. Suddenly, the unmistakable heavy thud of the massive mahogany front doors slamming shut echoed from the foyer downstairs. I froze. The blood instantly drained from my face. I cannot believe the boutique tried to charge us extra for the rush alterations. My mother's voice complained loudly, the sound drifting directly up the grand staircase. "It is fine, Mom." Brittany's voice echoed back her designer heels, clicking sharply against the marble floor. I put it on Jamal's platinum card anyway. Let him deal with it. We have exactly 4 hours to get our hair and makeup done before the gala caterers arrive. Let us go upstairs and get changed. My heart stopped. I was standing in the middle of the master bedroom. The safe was wide open. The black ledger was sitting on the vanity. The sound of their footsteps was already ascending the stairs, heading directly toward the bedroom doors. I was trapped. I was trapped. Adrenaline spiked through my veins like ice water. I had less than 10 seconds before the heavy brass handles of the bedroom doors turned. I threw the black leather ledger back into the matte steel safe, not even bothering to arrange it under the velvet jewelry boxes. I slammed the heavy metal door shut, wincing at the loud mechanical click of the locking mechanism. I shoved the oversized oil painting of my sister back into place against the wall. The hidden hinges glided silently, snapping flush, just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I lunged to my left, diving into Brittany's cavernous glass-enclosed walk-in closet. I pulled the frosted door shut behind me, pressing my back against a rack of silk evening gowns. My chest heaved. I clamped both hands over my mouth to muffle the sound of my ragged breathing. The master bedroom doors swung open with a dramatic bang. My mother's voice carried into the room, shrill and exhausted. "I simply do not understand why the seamstress could not rush the alterations," Patricia complained. "We are paying them a fortune. Your father and I have liquidated absolutely everything for this weekend. The least they can do is ensure the beadwork on your bodice is perfect." I heard the dull thud of shopping bags hitting the floor. "It is fine, Mom." Brittany sighed, her voice dripping with irritation. "I told you Jamal is handling all the extra expenses. He has unlimited capital right now. The investors are practically throwing money at him. We just need to look perfect for the gala. The society photographers will be everywhere." I needed an exit strategy. If I stayed hidden and they started going through the closet for their gala outfits, I would be cornered with no excuse. I had to take the initiative. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression into a mask of dull submission. I pushed the frosted glass door open and stepped out of the closet. Brittany spun around. She shrieked, dropping her designer handbag. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest. "What are you doing in here?" Brittany demanded. Her eyes darted wildly around the master suite, scanning the vanity, the bed, and finally landing back on me. Her shock instantly morphed into absolute fury. "You filthy little rat! How did you get in here?" I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "Jamal sent me," I said, keeping my voice meek and trembling. "He realized he forgot his lucky silver cufflinks for the investor meeting this afternoon. He told me to use the service gate code and fetch them from his valet tray." Brittany's eyes narrowed. She marched across the room, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood. She stopped inches from my face. I could smell the expensive champagne she and my mother had been drinking at the boutique. "He sent you to my house, without telling me." Brittany scoffed, crossing her arms. She looked over at the closet, then back at my plain, damp clothes. "You are lying. You are snooping. You are jealous because you live in a miserable little box, and you wanted to see what real wealth looks like." I shook my head, shrinking back slightly to play the part. "I swear, Brittany, he said they were on the top shelf of his accessory case. I was just trying to find them so I would not get fired. I need this job." My mother stepped into the doorway of the bedroom. Her face was a mask of cold disdain. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a pest that had infested her daughter's pristine home. "You have always been a deeply envious girl, Quinn," Patricia said, her voice laced with disappointment. "You failed at your own career, and now you skulk around your sister's home trying to steal a glimpse of the life you threw away. It is pathetic." I swallowed hard, keeping my hands unclenched at my sides. "I just want to get the cufflinks and go back to the office," I murmured. Brittany stepped even closer. Her eyes gleamed with a toxic, triumphant light. She had the audience she craved, and she had the victim she despised. "You are not taking anything from this house," Brittany spat. Before I could even blink, she raised her hand and slapped me squarely across the face. The crack of her palm against my cheek echoed like a gunshot in the large bedroom. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side. A sharp, stinging heat exploded across my skin. I tasted the metallic tang of copper as my teeth cut into the inside of my lip. I stood perfectly still. I did not raise my hand to touch my burning cheek. I did not cry out. I just slowly turned my head back to look at her. "Stop snooping in a life you will never have, loser," Brittany hissed, her face flushed with venomous satisfaction. "Now get out of my house before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I looked past her shoulder. My mother was standing in the doorway, her arms elegantly folded. Patricia did not flinch. She did not reprimand her golden child. She simply gave a slow, approving nod, validating the violence as a necessary correction for my supposed insubordination. "Yes, Brittany," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "I am leaving." I turned and walked toward the bedroom doors. I did not run. I kept my posture defeated and my shoulders slumped, playing the role of the broken scapegoat until the very last second. I walked past my mother, who stepped aside as if my mere proximity might soil her cashmere coat. I descended the grand staircase, the sting on my cheek radiating with every step. I walked out the heavy front doors and stepped back into the humid afternoon air. The moment the gate clicked shut behind me, my posture straightened. The meek, terrified sister vanished. I reached into my pocket and gripped my phone. The burning sensation on my face was nothing compared to the fiery rush of absolute victory surging through my chest. I had the ledger, I had the routing numbers, I had the Cayman Island accounts. The slap was just the final nail in her own coffin. I walked the 3 blocks to my rented sedan, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I pulled down the visor mirror and looked at my reflection. A bright red handprint was blossoming across my left cheek. I smiled. It was a masterpiece. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, dialing Arthur Winston's direct secure line. He answered on the first ring. "I have everything," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Tell Agent Vance to prep the federal warrants. The money is in an offshore shell called Horizon Apex Holdings out of Nassau. I am transmitting the encrypted photos to your secure server right now." "Excellent work," Quinn Winston said, his tone thick with relief. "Vance is already moving." Just as I hit send on the encrypted file transfer, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently in the cup holder. I glanced down. The caller ID flashed Jamal's name. I let it ring 3 times before hitting the speaker button. "Hello?" I answered, injecting a note of nervous hesitation into my voice. Quinn Jamal shouted. The background noise sounded chaotic, like he was standing in the middle of a windstorm. His voice was pitched high, laced with raw, unfiltered panic. "Where are you? Are you back at the office?" "I am on my way back now," I lied smoothly. "I could not find the cufflinks. Brittany was home and she kicked me out." Forget the damn cufflinks, Jamal roared, completely ignoring the fact that his wife had just assaulted his assistant. We have a massive catastrophe. The anonymous landowner of the harbor project just sent a courier to the main office. They bypassed my lawyers entirely. They served us with a final notice of default on the commercial ground lease. I kept my face perfectly blank, staring at the road ahead. Oh my God, Jamal. What does that mean? It means they know we do not have the permits, he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. It means they are terminating the lease immediately. They are seizing the land. If I lose that land, the investors will demand an audit. If they audit me, I am dead. I need you to get back to the office right now and start shredding the physical mail. Do you hear me? Shred everything. I smiled, the red handprint on my cheek stretching tight. I will get right on it, Jamal, I said softly. And then I hung up the phone. The drive back to the Apex Horizons office was a blur of adrenaline and cold calculation. The tires of my rental car screeched against the wet pavement as I whipped into the parking garage beneath the corporate building. I slammed the shifter into park, my heart pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. The physical sting on my cheek from Brittany's slap had faded into a dull throb, replaced entirely by the icy focus of the task ahead. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor, stepping out into a reception area that looked like a war zone. Jamal had absolutely lost his mind. The pristine, minimalist office space was completely trashed. Framed architectural renderings were smashed on the floor. Drawers from the receptionist's desk had been yanked out and dumped. A heavy-duty industrial shredder was screaming in the corner, choking on thick stacks of financial documents. Standing amidst the chaos, his custom-tailored suit jacket discarded and his tie loosened, was Jamal. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he frantically fed more paper into the machine's grinding teeth. He snapped his head toward me the second the elevator doors chimed. "Lock the front doors," he barked, his voice ragged and echoing in the empty office. "Lock them right now and get over here. They are trying to bury me, Quinn. The landowner is trying to void the ground lease because of the toxic soil audit. If that lease defaults, the bank pulls the construction loan. If the bank pulls the loan, the SEC gets notified." I walked over and locked the glass double doors, watching him unravel. This was the man who had tormented me, who had stolen my parents' retirement, who had turned my sister into a monster. Seeing him reduce himself to a panicked, sweating mess was intoxicating, but I kept my face frozen in an expression of meek terror. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice trembling perfectly on command. "I can help you shred the vendor files." He abandoned the shredder and closed the distance between us in 3 massive strides. He grabbed me by the upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my flesh. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. He dragged me forcefully toward my cubicle, shoving me down into my desk chair with enough violence that the wheels slammed into the partition behind me. "Shredding the mail is not going to save the harbor project," he hissed, leaning over me, trapping me against the desk. He slammed a heavy manicured hand flat against my keyboard. "The default notice is entirely contingent on the environmental clearance. Director Evans refused to issue the waiver for the soil contamination. But you still have your administrative login credentials from when you worked at the municipal zoning office. You are going to log into the city portal right now and generate a clean environmental clearance certificate." I stared up at him, letting my eyes widen in feigned horror. "Jamal, I cannot do that. That is federal wire fraud. It is tampering with government servers. If they catch me, I will go to prison. I do not even know if my old passwords still work." He leaned closer, his face inches from mine, the smell of expensive cologne masking the sour stench of his panic. "You will make them work, Quinn," he snarled, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. "Because if you do not, I will make sure you take the fall for every single forged document in this office. Your signature is on half the vendor checks. I will tell the authorities you orchestrated the entire fraud to get back at your family. I will ruin you. You log in and you generate that clearance right now, or I swear to God you will not walk out of this building." He was threatening my life, but he was entirely oblivious to the fact that I was holding the exact weapon needed to destroy his. "Okay," I whispered, letting a fake tear spill over my eyelashes. "Okay, Jamal, just step back. Let me think. I need to run the bypass protocol. He stepped back, crossing his arms, hovering over my shoulder like a vulture. I turned to my monitors. My hands were actually shaking, which played perfectly into the act. I opened a series of complex-looking coding windows to obscure my screen. I pulled up the municipal zoning portal, pretending to struggle with the authentication firewall. But underneath that decoy window, I opened the encrypted communication channel Arthur Winston had provided me. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, keeping it hidden beneath the edge of the desk. I connected it to the computer via a hidden USB cable. The high-resolution photographs I had taken inside the mansion safe, the Cayman Island routing numbers, the Bahamian shell company ledgers, the definitive proof of Jamal's offshore money laundering began to transfer. The progress bar appeared on my screen, a tiny blue line hidden behind the cascading text of the municipal login screen. 10%, 20%. Hurry up! Jamal shouted, slamming his fist against the partition wall. The courier needs to take that clearance to the landowner's legal team before the gala starts tonight. We have less than 3 hours. I am bypassing the two-factor authentication. I lied, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The system is fighting me. I have to route it through a proxy server so they cannot trace the IP address back to your office. 40%. 50%. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every time Jamal shifted his weight, I expected him to notice the encrypted transfer protocol running in the background. If he saw the FBI seal on the upload destination, he would likely kill me right here in the cubicle. I forced myself to breathe evenly, clicking through useless zoning files to keep his eyes occupied. 70%, 80%. I need you to pull up the master template for the soil waiver, I said, deliberately giving him a task to distract his attention. It is on the shared network drive under the Evans file. I need the exact header dimensions to make the forgery pass the automated scanner. Jamal grunted and stomped over to his own glass-enclosed office to retrieve the file. The second he turned his back, the upload progress bar hit 100%. Transfer complete. Delivery confirmed to Special Agent Sarah Vance. I instantly closed the encrypted channel and wiped the cache. The real weapon was deployed. Now I just needed to hand him the dummy grenade. I quickly opened a standard PDF editing software. I pulled an old legitimate environmental clearance form from a previous unrelated project. I deleted the old address and hastily typed in the harbor project coordinates. I copied a digital PNG file of Director Evans' signature and slapped it onto the bottom line. I added a fake bright red municipal approval stamp. It was a sloppy, terrible forgery that would never pass a legitimate audit, but Jamal was far too desperate to notice the imperfections. I hit print just as Jamal marched back over to my desk. The heavy laser printer on the corner table hummed to life. It spit out a single warm sheet of paper. Jamal lunged for it. He snatched the paper from the tray, his eyes scanning the fraudulent text, absorbing the fake approval stamp and the forged signature. The transformation was instantaneous. The sheer, unadulterated panic vanished from his face, replaced by a towering, sickening wave of arrogance. His shoulders dropped. He let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the ruined office. He looked at the paper, then looked down at me sitting in the cubicle chair. "I told you it was simple," he said, his chest puffing out with absolute superiority. He tapped the paper against his palm, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "You know your place, Quinn. You might be a miserable, jealous failure, but when push comes to shove, you follow orders. You are a good little obedient dog." I stared back at him, my expression perfectly flat, masking the roaring inferno of satisfaction inside my chest. "Clean up this mess," he commanded, gesturing vaguely to the shredded paper covering the floor. "I have a $3 million charity gala to host tonight, and I need to go put on a tuxedo. Make sure my car is brought to the front." He turned his back on me, slipping the fake clearance form into his briefcase. He walked out of the office, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the debris of his own panic. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside, utterly convinced he had just saved his empire. He was entirely unaware that he had just handed his own death warrant directly to the federal government. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and tonight the entire glittering illusion was going to burn to the ground. I had a front row seat, and I was not going to miss a single second. Saturday morning dawned crisp and brilliantly clear, washing the financial district in harsh, unforgiving light. It was the perfect weather for a reckoning. I sat across from Arthur Winston and Special Agent Sarah Vance, the heavy mahogany desk covered in blown-up photographs of Jamal's black ledger. The atmosphere in Winston's corner office crackled with lethal, absolute efficiency. Vance looked up from a thick stack of freshly printed federal warrants, her severe expression replaced by a cold, predatory smile. The routing numbers were a perfect match, Vance stated, sliding a heavy document toward me. We traced the Cayman Island accounts directly to Jamal's shell corporations in Nassau. The Department of Justice signed off on the global asset freeze exactly 30 minutes ago. He is officially locked out of every offshore and domestic account. His empire is frozen solid, and he will not even realize it until he tries to move the funds. And the arrest, I asked, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. Coordinated for maximum impact and zero flight risk, Vance replied, tapping a pen against the desk. Jamal is scheduled to deliver his keynote address at 9 o'clock tonight in the main ballroom of the mansion. The moment he takes the stage, my tactical teams are sealing the entire perimeter of the estate. We are rolling in with 24 federal agents, local law enforcement support, and the Asset Forfeiture Division. We are hitting the front doors, the service gates, and the courtyard simultaneously. He is not getting out. Winston leaned forward, interlacing his fingers with a look of deep satisfaction. The fake environmental clearance you handed him bought us exactly the window we needed, Quinn. The anonymous landowner's legal team rejected it the moment Jamal's courier dropped it off. The default on the ground lease is now absolute. Apex Horizons is effectively dead, but Jamal is too blinded by his own towering ego to see the guillotine dropping. He thinks he won. I left Winston's office at noon, stepping out into the bustling city streets. For years, I had worn the cheap drab uniform of the family failure. I had hidden my sharp intelligence behind baggy sweaters, silent submission, and a starched maid's apron. But tonight I was not attending the charity gala as the disgraced sister. I was not going as the obedient fired assistant. I was attending as the anonymous landowner who had just destroyed Apex Horizons. I was attending as the billionaire CEO of my grandfather's legacy. I needed armor. I walked into the most exclusive evening wear boutique in the luxury shopping district, a sprawling showroom guarded by velvet ropes and salespeople who judged your net worth the second you crossed the threshold. The boutique manager, a tall woman with severe platinum hair, took one look at my damp sneakers and plain dark jacket. She immediately stepped forward to intercept me, blocking my path to the designer racks. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her tone dripping with polished, icy condescension. "This showroom is strictly by appointment only. I am afraid we cannot accommodate walk-ins looking for prom attire." I did not argue. I did not apologize. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy matte black titanium centurion card tied directly to my grandfather's blind trust. I placed it flat on the illuminated glass display counter. "I need a custom evening gown," I said, my voice projecting absolute unbothered authority. "I need it tailored to fit me perfectly by 6 o'clock tonight, and I need your entire styling team at my disposal. Money is no object." The manager stared at the legendary black card, the color rapidly draining from her face. The condescension vanished, replaced instantly by breathless panic and obsequious charm. "Right away, madam," she stammered frantically, waving over two assistants from across the room. "Please step into the VIP suite. We will bring you champagne immediately." For the next 4 hours, the private suite became a blur of measuring tape silk and breathless alterations. I rejected the frilly, heavily sequined gowns that Brittany would have instinctively chosen. Instead, I selected a sleek, floor-length column gown in midnight navy silk. It was devoid of excessive embellishments, relying entirely on architectural razor-sharp tailoring that clung to my frame like liquid armor. The dress projected wealth, power, and absolute dominance. A professional stylist arrived shortly after, sweeping my hair up into a sophisticated modern twist. A makeup artist went to work highlighting my features carefully, erasing the tired, beaten-down girl of the past and revealing the sharp, calculating woman beneath. She flawlessly concealed the faint red mark still lingering on my cheek from Brittany's slap. When I finally stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, I hardly recognized the reflection staring back at me. I looked lethal. I looked like a woman who owned the city. I was just slipping my feet into a pair of towering black stilettos when my cell phone rang from inside my purse on the velvet ottoman. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I picked up the phone, letting the silence stretch for a deliberate beat before speaking. "Hello, Richard." "Where are you?" my father demanded, his voice rough with stress and barely concealed rage. "We have been trying to reach you all afternoon. Jamal is having a crisis with the venue lighting and you are nowhere to be found. This is exactly the kind of pathetic, unreliable behavior that proves why you will never amount to anything. I have been busy preparing for tonight," I replied smoothly, checking my reflection one last time. "Well, you can stop whatever useless thing you are doing," he snapped. "I am calling to formally relieve you of your duties. Jamal does not want you anywhere near the property tonight. You have caused enough trouble with your jealousy, and quite frankly, you are an absolute embarrassment to high society. We have important investors attending this gala. We have people with real wealth and influence. The last thing we need is you skulking around the ballroom in your cheap clothes, reminding everyone of the family failure." He paused, letting his cruel words sink in, expecting me to cry, apologize, or beg for a second chance. He expected the old Quinn to break. "Do not bother showing up to the gala." "Quinn," he finalized, his tone dripping with absolute disgust. "Your services are no longer required and you are not welcome." I picked up my black clutch, snapping the gold clasp shut. I looked at my reflection, the midnight blue silk catching the light, knowing that the real wealth he was so desperately trying to impress was standing right here holding the phone. "I'll be there," I replied simply, and hung up. I dropped my phone into my black clutch and turned away from the mirror. The midnight blue silk of the column gown clung to me flawlessly, moving like liquid armor, but the ensemble was missing its most crucial piece. I reached deep into the bottom of my purse and pulled out a small, worn navy velvet box. Inside rested Grandma Beatrice's legendary diamond heirloom necklace. The piece was an absolute masterpiece of vintage craftsmanship, featuring 3 cascading tiers of flawless, brilliant cut diamonds. My mother had completely torn our childhood home apart, looking for this exact necklace after the funeral. She had fired 2 housekeepers and threatened to sue the hospice nurses, screaming that someone had stolen her rightful inheritance. She never knew that Grandma Beatrice had slipped the velvet box directly into my backpack the week before she passed away. She had told me to keep it hidden and save it for the day I finally stopped apologizing for my own existence. Today was that day. I fastened the heavy platinum clasp around my neck. The diamonds settled perfectly against my collarbone, catching the harsh boutique lighting and throwing shattered rainbows across the room. I looked lethal. I looked like a woman who owned the city. The Apex Horizons Charity Gala was being held at the Grand Atrium, a massive historic glass and steel conservatory located right in the center of the city's botanical district. It was the most exclusive, fiercely guarded venue in the state. As my hired black sedan pulled up to the curb, the scene outside was a chaotic blur of flashing paparazzi cameras, valet drivers sprinting between luxury cars and women in thousands of dollars worth of couture, carefully navigating the wet pavement. I bypassed the red carpet photo line and walked directly toward the main entrance. 2 massive security guards in dark suits immediately stepped forward, crossing their muscular arms and completely blocking the heavy double-glass doors. The head of security, a man with a thick neck and a coiled earpiece, held up a digital tablet. "I am sorry, miss," he said, his voice flat and uncompromising. "We have strict instructions from the event organizers. You are on the restricted list. Mr. Richard Wilson and Mr. Jamal Vance made it explicitly clear that you are not to be permitted inside this venue under any circumstances. If you do not leave the premises immediately, I will have to physically remove you." I did not back away. I simply stood my ground, staring directly into his eyes, waiting for the precise timing we had arranged. A sleek silver town car pulled up directly behind me at the curb. Arthur Winston stepped out, buttoning his impeccably tailored suit jacket. He walked up the marble steps with the calm, measured authority of a man who held the keys to the kingdom. Two federal agents in plain clothes trailed discreetly behind him, blending seamlessly into the crowd. "There seems to be a severe misunderstanding, gentlemen," Winston said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the noise of the bustling entrance. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a thick stack of legally bound documents featuring a bright gold embossed seal. He handed the paperwork directly to the head of security. "You are currently operating under the assumption that Jamal Vance controls this venue tonight." Winston continued adjusting his cuffs. "That is factually incorrect. As of 2 o'clock this afternoon, the holding company that owns the Grand Atrium was acquired in its entirety by my client's blind trust. Miss Quinn Wilson is not a guest at this gala. She is the chief executive officer of the corporation that owns the very ground you are standing on. You are currently threatening to violently remove your own landlord from her own building. I strongly suggest you reconsider your employment choices." The security chief scanned the first page of the legal documents. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the entrance lights. He looked at the gold seal, looked at Winston, and finally looked at me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. He immediately shoved the tablet under his arm and took 2 very large steps backward. "My deepest apologies, Miss Wilson," he stammered, gesturing frantically for the other guard to step aside and pulling the heavy glass door open. "Please go right ahead. Have a wonderful evening." Winston offered me a slight, respectful nod. "9 o'clock sharp, Quinn," he murmured quietly. "The trap closes." I turned and walked through the doors. The main ballroom was a staggering display of stolen wealth. Massive floral arrangements towered over linen-draped tables. Waitstaff circulated with silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. A string quartet played softly in the far corner. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the city's absolute elite, the exact high society marks Jamal had been actively defrauding for years to fund this lavish lifestyle. As I stepped down the grand staircase into the main room, the effect was instantaneous. The midnight blue silk caught the ambient light, but it was the blinding fire of Grandma Beatrice's diamonds that commanded absolute attention. Heads began to turn. Conversations abruptly halted in mid-sentence. The clinking of crystal glasses faded away into a profound, stunned silence that rippled across the enormous ballroom. 300 powerful guests stopped entirely to stare at the woman they had previously only known as the pathetic fired family failure. I walked with absolute confidence, my shoulders back, feeling the collective weight of their shock. Across the room, standing beside a towering swan ice sculpture, was Brittany. She was draped in a custom gold sequined gown, laughing loudly at a joke my mother had just made, completely oblivious to the shifting atmosphere. Then she turned her head, her eyes locked onto me. I watched the arrogant, triumphant smile completely slide off her face, replaced by a look of total incomprehension. Her gaze dropped from my tailored designer dress directly to the legendary diamond necklace she had spent years desperately trying to find. The narcissistic injury was immediate and visceral. Her sister, the scapegoat she had slapped and humiliated mere hours ago, was currently outshining her at her own billion-dollar event. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Refusing to be upstaged in front of her high society peers, Brittany snatched a brimming crystal glass of dark red wine from a passing waiter's tray. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped the delicate stem. With absolute murder in her eyes, she began marching directly across the crowded ballroom floor, intending to completely destroy my dress and my dignity in front of the entire city. I watched her close the distance, tracking the violent, heavy rhythm of her footsteps against the polished marble floor. Brittany pushed past a group of tech executives, not even bothering to apologize, as she shoved a woman in a silver cocktail dress out of her way. The dark red vintage wine sloshed dangerously near the rim of her crystal glass. Her eyes were locked onto mine, completely feral, burning with the desperate need to put me back in the tiny, miserable box she had constructed for me. She assumed I would freeze. She assumed I would lower my head, shrink my shoulders, and allow her to publicly humiliate me, just like she had done in her master bedroom that afternoon. She expected me to play the role of the broken, subservient sister. As she closed the final 3 feet between us, she raised her arm high. She lunged forward with a sharp, hissing breath, snapping her wrist forward to hurl the staining red liquid directly at the bodice of my midnight blue silk gown. But I had spent 28 years memorizing her predictable narcissistic tantrums. I knew her exact trajectory. Before the wine could even leave the glass, my hand shot up with lightning speed. My fingers clamped down around her wrist like a vice of solid steel. The sudden jarring halt of her momentum caught her completely off guard. She gasped, her eyes flying wide in utter shock as her arm jolted to a stop in midair. "Not today, Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a register of absolute glacial coldness. Without breaking eye contact, I smoothly and forcefully twisted her wrist downward and backward. The sudden torque forced her hand to open. The heavy crystal goblet slipped from her fingers, tumbling directly against her own body. The entire glass of deep blood-red wine splashed violently against her chest. The dark liquid cascaded down the front of her pristine white designer gown, instantly soaking into the expensive silk fabric and pooling heavily over her bare ankles and white designer shoes. The glass hit the floor, shattering into dozens of glittering pieces across the marble. Brittany let out an ear-piercing, horrified shriek. She stumbled backward, staring down at the massive, spreading red stain ruining her immaculate tens of thousands of dollars worth of couture. She raised her hands, trembling uncontrollably, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low hum of elite conversation died out entirely. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest and most influential citizens stood frozen, staring in absolute silence at the unhinged woman dripping in spilled wine. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch as she pointed a shaking, wine-stained finger at my face. "What did you just do to me?" "I did nothing but defend my property," I replied evenly, not stepping back a single inch. "You really should learn to handle your alcohol." A sudden aggressive commotion broke out at the edge of the crowd. Richard and Patricia pushed violently through the ring of stunned spectators. My mother took one look at Brittany's ruined white dress and let out a dramatic, breathless gasp, pressing both hands against her chest as if she might collapse. My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He marched directly toward me, his fists clenched at his sides, ready to exert the terrifying dominance he had used to control our family for decades. "Are you out of your mind?" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing fiercely through the quiet ballroom. He stopped inches from my face, vibrating with rage. "I told you specifically that you were banned from this property. You come in here dressed like some street corner imposter, and you violently attack your own sister." "I stopped her from throwing a drink at me, Richard," I stated calmly. "Do not you dare speak back to me!" he roared, his spit flying through the air. "You are a psychotic, jealous failure. You have completely lost your mind. I am calling the police this exact second. I am having you arrested for assault and criminal trespassing. You are going to be dragged out of this venue in handcuffs, and I will personally ensure you spend the night in a holding cell." Patricia rushed to Brittany's side, dabbing uselessly at the soaked silk with a cocktail napkin. She glared up at me with absolute venom. "You have always been a monster, Quinn, always trying to destroy everything beautiful your sister has." But as Patricia glared, her eyes flicked upward, catching the harsh ballroom light reflecting off my collarbone. She froze. The cocktail napkin slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the wet floor. Her breath hitched audibly. She was staring directly at Grandma Beatrice's legendary diamond heirloom necklace, the piece she had torn her house apart searching for, the piece she believed was her divine birthright. Her mouth fell open in mute, horrified recognition. "Where did you—" Patricia stammered, pointing a shaking finger at my throat. "How did you get that? Take that off immediately. That belongs to me." "Security!" Richard shouted, completely ignoring his wife's sudden paralysis. He waved his arm frantically toward the edges of the room. "I want this woman restrained and removed right now. Call the authorities." Before the security chief could even begin to step forward, the massive crystal chandeliers above us suddenly dimmed. The ambient light in the grand ballroom dropped to a dramatic theater-style darkness. Richard stopped mid-shout. Brittany stopped crying. The crowd murmured in confusion, their attention instantly pulled away from our confrontation. A sharp, brilliant white spotlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the grand stage at the far end of the room. A sleek, transparent acrylic podium stood in the center of the light. Walking up the side steps, adjusting his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket, and sporting a blinding, arrogant smile was Jamal. He stepped up to the microphone, tapping it twice to ensure it was on. The feedback echoed through the cavernous space. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." Jamal's voice boomed through the sophisticated sound system, dripping with false humility and towering ego. "Thank you all for joining us tonight at this magnificent venue. Tonight is a celebration of vision of progress and of the limitless future of Apex Horizons." He paused, letting the silence stretch, surveying the wealthy marks in the audience with the eyes of a predator who thought he was at the top of the food chain. But before we discuss the incredible new harbor development, Jamal continued, pressing a hand to his chest. "I need to take a moment to honor the foundation of my success. A man is nothing without the people who believed in him when it was just an idea. I am standing here tonight because of the unwavering support of my beloved family, and more importantly, my primary investors." Jamal beamed, extending a hand out toward the darkness of the ballroom floor, pointing directly toward the spot where my father and mother were standing. "Richard, Patricia," he called out warmly, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Please stand up and let this room recognize you. You are the backbone of Apex Horizons. You are the reason this billion-dollar project is possible. Let us hear it for my incredible family." A polite round of applause began to ripple through the room. A second spotlight suddenly swung through the darkness, locking directly onto my parents. Richard puffed out his chest, his anger momentarily overridden by his desperate need for public validation. Patricia quickly plastered on a stiff, aristocratic smile, attempting to step away from the puddle of spilled wine. They stood in the harsh, bright light, proudly claiming their status as the primary financial backers of Jamal's empire. They smiled for the crowd, completely and utterly oblivious to the fact that heavily armed federal agents were currently swarming the perimeter of the building, and the trap had just snapped shut. The spotlight on Jamal was blinding, his ego ballooning to fill every corner of the ballroom. He stood at the podium, basking in the sea of expensive suits and sequined gowns, fully convinced he had successfully leveraged my forced labor to secure his future. He didn't just look confident. He looked untouchable, his hand hovering over the remote that would project the glittering future of his empire to the city's most elite financiers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jamal boomed, his voice resonant and practiced, "we are on the precipice of greatness. What you are about to see is the culmination of years of tireless work, strategic vision, and unyielding ambition. The harbor project will redefine this city's skyline, and frankly, I am offering you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be a part of it. I need $50 million in final capital to break ground next month. Who is ready to build the future?" He pressed the clicker with a flourish, his face split into a wide, triumphant grin. He turned expectantly toward the massive projection screens that spanned the width of the stage, ready to bathe in the collective awe of the investors. But there was no 3D rendering. There were no sleek glass towers, no verdant rooftop gardens, and no soaring architectural designs. The screens flickered once, then displayed a cold, stark white background dominated by bold, aggressive black text. The font was jagged and official, impossible to miss. At the very top, the words, "Notice of Eviction, Lease Termination and Fraud," spanned the entire screen. Below it, in precise legal clarity, were the termination clauses of the commercial ground lease for the harbor site, clearly citing the lack of necessary environmental permits. Beside the lease information, a second image loaded a scanned copy of the fraudulent environmental clearance form I had printed, circled in red with the word "forged" stamped over it in digital ink. The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps, whispers, and the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Jamal's face went white. He clutched the podium, his knuckles turning ivory as his eyes darted from the screen to the audience. He clicked the remote again, desperate to switch the image, but the system had been overridden. Another document flashed the offshore routing numbers I had sent to Agent Vance, followed by a list of names of every shell corporation he had used to hide his embezzled funds. It was a total systematic dismantling of his character and his business. I didn't wait for him to find his voice. I rose from my seat, the midnight blue silk of my gown rustling softly as I moved. Every eye in the room followed my progress. I felt the sharp, cool weight of Grandma Beatrice's diamonds against my skin, a reminder of who I really was. I walked toward the stage with the grace of a woman who had known this moment was coming for years. The security team didn't try to stop me. They stood motionless, their earpieces silent, having already been briefed by Winston on the true ownership of the venue. I climbed the steps to the stage. Jamal was frozen, a deer caught in the headlights of his own impending destruction. He looked like he wanted to scream, but the microphone was still live, and the entire room was watching his reaction. I approached the podium, my expression calm, my focus absolute. I reached out and gently removed the microphone from its clip, placing it on the stand. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." My voice echoed through the ballroom, cool and resonant. It carried over the hushed crowd with a precision that silenced even the most aggressive whispers. I looked toward the center of the room, locking eyes with my father and Brittany. They looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated in the harsh light of the unfolding scandal. As the legal owner of the land beneath this fantasy project, I am here to announce that this development is officially canceled. Jamal's mouth worked silently, his hands gripping the podium so hard I could hear the wood creak. He leaned in his voice, a frantic low hiss that only I could hear through the mics. "How did you do this? How did you get the lease documents?" I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I turned back to the audience, my posture perfect, my gaze encompassing the room. Apex Horizons has been operating under a cloud of deceit. I continued, my voice steady. The documentation you were just shown is evidence of a massive fraud that has been under federal investigation for months. My name is Quinn Wilson. I am the CEO of Horizon Apex Holdings, the firm that holds the primary title to the harbor site. And I am here to tell you that this project will not move forward, not under Jamal Vance, and certainly not with your capital. I paused, scanning the room. I saw the faces of investors shifting from curiosity to pure cold rage as they realized how much money they had just nearly lost. Then I heard the sound that had been waiting for us all night, the heavy metallic thud of the ballroom's main doors being kicked open. "Federal agents, nobody move." The voice was booming, authoritative, and unmistakable. Agent Sarah Vance, flanked by a dozen heavily armed tactical officers, marched down the center aisle. The crowd scrambled, pushing back from the tables. Jamal reached for his briefcase, likely intending to bolt, but he was too late. He turned to flee, but two agents were already waiting at the back of the stage. They didn't bother with a formal conversation. They pinned him against the projection equipment, the plastic ties clicking sharply as they secured his wrists behind his back. He didn't go down without a fight. He kicked, he screamed, he cursed at me, his voice a raw, jagged sound that shattered the gala's veneer of high-class sophistication. He called me every name he could think of, his face purple with fury, demanding to know how a pitiful, jealous assistant had managed to bring down a billion-dollar machine. I watched the officers drag him across the stage. I watched him pass right by the spot where my father and Brittany sat. Richard looked like he wanted to reach out, but the look of pure, unadulterated terror on his face kept him rooted to his chair. Brittany was buried in her wine-stained gown, shaking with shock, her previous jealousy eclipsed by the sheer reality of the scene playing out in front of the city's power players. The ballroom had become a staging ground for the final act. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the heavy, cold satisfaction of a debt finally paid. The project was dead. Jamal was finished. And for the first time, I felt the clean, sharp air of a life where I no longer had to answer to anyone. I leaned into the microphone one last time, my eyes finding the lens of the news crew that had been recording the entire debacle from the balcony. "This is the end of an era," I stated clearly, "and the beginning of the truth." As the agents hustled Jamal toward the exit, I stepped off the stage, my heels clicking perfectly on the floor. I didn't look back at the chaos. I didn't look back at the wreckage of my family's social standing. I simply walked toward the exit, ready to go home and finally completely sleep. The silence that followed my announcement lasted for exactly 2 seconds before the entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest elites began shouting over one another, dropping their champagne flutes and scrambling for their phones. The collective panic of a room full of people realizing their millions were suddenly evaporating created a deafening, suffocating roar. Jamal staggered backward as if I had physically struck him. The arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn just moments ago melted off his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He frantically looked around for his security team, but they were already stepping away, refusing to intervene. Desperation took over. He lunged across the podium, snatching the spare microphone from its stand with trembling, sweaty hands. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Jamal screamed into the mic, his voice cracking hysterically over the sound system. "She is lying. This woman is a psychotic fired assistant. She is my former employee having a complete and total mental breakdown in front of all of you. Security, get this crazy woman off my stage." He pointed a shaking finger at me, sweating profusely under the harsh stage lights. "She is a fraud," he continued, panting heavily. "The harbor project is entirely secure. The land is secured. She has absolutely zero authority here." I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate, shrill voice echo through the massive glass conservatory. I did not raise my voice or attempt to shout over him. I simply looked out into the front row of VIP tables and gave a sharp, definitive nod. Arthur Winston stepped forward from the shadows of the stage wing. He was trailed by 4 impeccably dressed paralegals. They moved with coordinated, lethal efficiency, walking directly along the edge of the stage. Without a word, they began distributing thick, heavy, legally bound folders to every single major investor seated in the front row. The loud thuds of the heavy paper hitting the linen-draped tables sounded like a series of executioner gavels. I raised my microphone, my voice slicing effortlessly through Jamal's frantic rambling. "I am not a fired assistant," I stated, my tone dropping the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "And I am not having a breakdown. My name is Quinn Wilson. I am the sole legal heir to the estate of Beatrice Wilson and the majority shareholder of the trust that currently owns every single asset you thought you were investing in." Jamal froze, the microphone slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. He looked at me, his eyes wide, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of what I had just said. He had spent years dismissing me, treating me as a mindless servant, completely oblivious to the fact that Grandma Beatrice had quietly transferred her entire empire into a blind trust with my name on it before she passed away. The investors in the front row tore open the folders. I watched their faces contort from confusion to absolute horror as they scanned the highlighted documents. "You are not investors in a groundbreaking real estate development." I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, owning every inch of the space. "You are the victims of a textbook Ponzi scheme. Jamal Vance does not own the harbor site. He has never owned the harbor site. He has been using your initial capital to pay off early investors, funding a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle while simultaneously drowning in illegal debt." "Lies." Jamal shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "It is all lies. If you turn to the first section of your packets," I instructed the crowd, completely ignoring his outburst, "you will find a file named fake_permit_1.docx. This document contains the fabricated environmental clearance reports he used to secure your initial deposits. If you turn the page, you will find offshore_transfer_2.docx, which explicitly details the offshore wire transfers where your money currently sits. Moving to forged_land_deed_3.docx, you will see the forged land deeds he presented to the City Planning Commission. And finally, debt_ledger_4.docx outlines the massive high-interest debts Jamal owes to a very violent, very unforgiving syndicate of underground lenders. He was never going to build a harbor. He was going to take your final $50 million tonight and disappear on a private jet before sunrise. The ballroom descended into an uproar. Men in tailored suits were shouting, throwing the folders onto the floor, pulling out their phones to call their legal teams. I turned my gaze away from the investors and locked eyes with my parents. Richard and Patricia were standing perfectly still in the center of the room, their faces pale, watching their golden son-in-law completely unravel. But Jamal did not just steal from his corporate investors, I said, my voice softening into a sharp, lethal blade. He stole from the people who defended him, enabled him, and loved him the most. I raised the clicker in my hand and pressed the button. The massive projection screens behind me instantly shifted. The eviction notice vanished, replaced by blown-up high-resolution images of private bank statements. The names at the top of the accounts were displayed in massive, undeniable letters: Richard Wilson and Patricia Wilson. The crowd gasped as the screen highlighted a series of aggressive, unauthorized wire transfers. I watched my father's eyes track the numbers on the screen. I watched him realize that the massive sums of money leaving his accounts had not been going toward a high-yield corporate bond. They had been routed directly into Jamal's personal offshore holding accounts. Over the past 72 hours, Jamal used the power of attorney you so graciously granted him to liquidate your entire retirement fund, your investment portfolios, and the equity on your home, I announced, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear their humiliation. He drained your accounts down to absolute zero to pay off a single loan shark. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. Patricia stared at the giant glaring zero on the screen. The reality of her sudden, complete destitution hit her like a freight train. Her eyes rolled back into her head. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream before her knees buckled, and she collapsed, completely fainting in a heap of designer fabric on the cold marble floor. Brittany dropped to her knees beside her mother, screaming for a doctor, completely covered in the wine she had tried to throw at me. Richard did not look at his wife. He did not look at his favorite daughter. His face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged as he stared at the screen, then slowly turned his head to look at Jamal. The realization that the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood had just robbed him of everything he had spent his entire life building broke his mind. "I will kill you!" Richard roared, a guttural, animalistic sound tearing from his throat. He launched himself forward, shoving past investors and sprinting up the stage stairs with terrifying speed. Jamal tried to back away, dropping the microphone, but Richard tackled him around the waist. The two men crashed hard onto the polished stage floor, knocking over the acrylic podium. Richard mounted Jamal, swinging his fists wildly, punching the man he had treated like a king directly in the face. As the two men brawled violently under the bright stage lights, a new sound cut through the chaos. The violent, piercing wail of heavy sirens echoed from outside the glass conservatory. Red and blue emergency lights began to flash frantically, illuminating the towering floral arrangements and the panicked faces of the elite guests. The heavy, ornate double doors at the main entrance burst open with a deafening crash. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents clad in dark tactical gear and carrying assault rifles marched in perfect aggressive unison straight down the center aisle. The lead federal agent strode up the stage steps with absolute uncompromising authority. The tactical team fanned out, forming an impenetrable wall between the stage and the panicked, murmuring crowd. Jamal squirmed violently against the grip of the two officers holding him, his expensive tuxedo jacket tearing at the seam, but his struggles were entirely useless against their trained strength. Jamal Vance, the lead agent, announced, her voice carrying a sharp metallic edge that required no microphone to command the room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and multiple violations of the Securities Exchange Act. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the agent continued reading him his rights, the heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Jamal's wrists with a final echoing snap. The sound seemed to break whatever spell was holding my family captive. Two officers pulled Richard off the stage floor, shoving him back roughly. My father stumbled, his chest heaving, his face drained of all color. He looked down at his hands, trembling uncontrollably. realizing that the empire he had mercilessly ruled for decades had evaporated in a matter of seconds. Beside him, Patricia was weeping hysterically, her carefully styled hair completely ruined, her hands clutching at the wine-soaked fabric of her gown. Brittany stared at Jamal as he was hauled to his feet. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the federal agents, the furious investors, and the glaring numbers on the massive projection screen that proved she was now entirely penniless. The reality of her situation crashed down on her all at once. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the exclusive country club memberships, and the sprawling mansion were gone. She had no marketable skills, no backup plan, and no money to her name. She was effectively homeless. She turned her head slowly, her tear-streaked mascara ruined face locking onto me. The arrogant, vicious bully who had slapped me just hours earlier was completely gone. In her place was a pathetic, terrified woman who had just watched her entire world burn to ash. Brittany dropped to her knees on the hard marble floor, crawling forward through the shattered glass of her own dropped wine goblet, ignoring the sharp edges cutting into her skin. "Quinn, please," Brittany sobbed, her voice a raw, desperate wail. She reached out with trembling, stained hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my midnight blue gown. "You have to stop this. Tell them it is a mistake. We are going to lose everything. We will be out on the street. You have the money now. You own the company. You can pay them off. You can save us, Quinn. Please, I am begging you." My father looked up, his eyes red and frantic. The man who had screamed that I was a psychotic failure, the man who had ordered security to drag me out in handcuffs, suddenly realized I was the only lifeline he had left. He took a stumbling step forward, his voice cracking with desperate manufactured emotion. "Quinn, listen to your sister, Richard," pleaded, his hands raised in surrender. "We are your parents. We are your blood. You cannot just stand there and watch your family be destroyed. We can fix this. We can work together as a family." Patricia dragged herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against my father, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, sweetheart," she cried out. "We are family." I looked down at the three of them. I felt no anger, no sorrow, and absolutely no guilt. After a lifetime of emotional abuse, constant belittlement, and vicious sabotage, looking at them felt like looking at strangers. A profound, icy detachment settled over me, shielding my heart in an impenetrable layer of armor. "Family protects each other," I said, my voice eerily calm, carrying a quiet, lethal finality. "You chose your golden child. Now enjoy the debt." I opened my small black clutch. I reached inside and pulled out the pieces of the $10,000 hush money check Jamal had tried to force on me that afternoon. I held the torn shreds of paper out in front of me, letting go. The pieces fluttered through the air like toxic confetti, drifting down to land directly on Jamal's chest as the agents dragged him forward. I turned my back on them and walked away. The sea of wealthy investors, federal agents, and terrified elites parted silently to let me through. 6 months later, the city's skyline looked remarkably different. I stood at the helm of Horizon Apex Holdings, managing a massive real estate empire with a sharp, uncompromising vision. The fraudulent harbor project had been permanently scrapped. In its place, I had converted the highly contested waterfront land into a sprawling, beautiful public park and cultural center. It featured botanical gardens, art pavilions, and a community conservatory completely free for the public to enjoy. I named it the Beatrice Wilson Botanical Gardens, ensuring my grandmother's true legacy would outlast us all. Jamal's trial was brief and devastating. Facing an insurmountable mountain of federal evidence, he took a plea deal and was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. As for my family, the fallout was absolute. Richard and Patricia's accounts had been completely drained by Jamal's offshore transfers. They were forced to file for total bankruptcy. The bank foreclosed on their sprawling estate, seizing their luxury vehicles, Patricia's jewelry, and every single asset they owned to satisfy the aggressive creditors. Stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their high society friends, they were forced to move into a cramped, cheap roadside motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. With no retirement funds and monumental debts hanging over their heads, Richard, Patricia, and Brittany were forced to take minimum wage retail jobs just to survive. Brittany now spent her days standing behind a cash register wearing a polyester uniform, scanning items for the exact kind of working-class people she used to viciously mock. They were trapped in a cycle of manual labor and crushing poverty, living the exact nightmare they had tried to force upon me. I leaned against the glass railing of my penthouse balcony, pulling my silk robe tighter against the cool evening breeze. I took a slow sip of my hot Earl Grey tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I looked out over the glittering skyline of the city I now practically owned. There was no anxiety in my chest. There was no fear of a ringing phone or a vicious text message. I breathed in the crisp night air completely and totally free from the chains of a toxic family. Have you ever realized that the best revenge is simply massive success? Share your thoughts below.